Chapter 573. A dozen cultivators stood disorderly in the wind and snow in front of Zhongsun Qinxue. Their figures were gradually covered by the wind and snow, but Zhongsun Qinxue's steps were even slower. The power released by these cultivators formed blue pillars of wind. The tops of these wind pillars reached into the sky and strangely connected together. Zhongsun Qinxue did not use the casual move she had used before. She sensed the movements of these cultivators and stabbed at the cultivator with the weakest presence. The coldness suddenly disappeared, and the air in this part of the world seemed to warm up. However, all of the coldness gathered in her sword, stabbing straight at that cultivator. The dozen cultivators shouted at the same time. Blue lines of fire suddenly appeared in the blue pillars of wind that were connected together like dragons. Pieces of glowing ice quickly gathered where Zhongsun Qinxue's sword was pointing, forming an ice spike dozens of feet long that stabbed towards that cultivator. Among the blue pillars of wind, countless blue flames fell towards this glowing ice spike like moths. The blue flames disappeared. Pieces of ice splashed off the surface of the ice spike and gradually shrank, disappearing a few feet in front of that cultivator. Zhongsun Qinxue's eyes seemed to burn with red embers, but her expression did not change at all. She took another step forward. The dozen cultivators who had formed a formation in the wind and snow shook violently and retreated a dozen steps at the same time. Multiple red lines appeared on the cultivator her sword was pointing at, and he had multiple wounds. Mo Ying naturally knew the power of the formation formed by the dozen cultivators. In reality, these cultivators from different sects had been following him all this time. They had formed this formation for more than a decade in order to prevent assassinations from the experts of the Bazinkendo ground. So he naturally knew the level Zhongsun Qinxue's sword represented. After many years of hiding, this eldest miss of the Gongsun family dared to cultivate this vicious sword that no one in the world dared to cultivate. She was not swallowed by the viciousness of this sword, and successfully stood among the strongest people in the world. But his gaze quickly left Zhongsun Qinxue's figure and looked at the young cultivator in black robes. He said, "I know you do not want to kill more people." His words were not a military order, but this was the first time Zhongsun Qinxue and Ding Ning had spoken as the commander after they entered the camp. So the entire camp was silent. "Since you do not want to kill more people, then we can talk." His gaze passed through the debris, and debris swept up by the wild wind and landed calmly on Ding Ning. He said, "If I am not wrong, you should be the heir to the 9-death silkworm. You have come to settle an old debt from the Bazinkendo ground." The entire camp stopped. All the soldiers, including the dozen cultivators who could be killed by Zhongsun Qinxue at any moment, stopped in their tracks. In this moment, time seemed to freeze in the camp, all because of the words 9-death silkworm. In Chongling, and even the entire Qin dynasty, nothing was more magical and soul-stirring than these 3 words. "All right," Ding Ning uttered a simple word. Zhongsun Qinxue stopped moving forward. Everyone in the camp stopped. Everyone's gaze gathered on Ding Ning. Many people couldn't help but tremble, including the dozen cultivators in the formation. "Whoever moves dies." Mo Ying glanced at Zhongsun Qinxue, who had stopped but still held the 9-Hell King sword, and said. All his subordinates understood the meaning of his words. This was not just an order, but a reminder. In the entire camp, other than him and the cultivators in the formation, no one else could stop Zhongsun Qinxue's attack. "I owe the Bazinkendo ground." Mo Ying looked at the only person in the camp who was moving. He walked towards Ding Ning in front of him and said directly. Then his expression grew indifferent. He said, "I was originally a pharmacist in the army. I interacted with cultivators on the front lines and learned some cultivation methods. Later, by chance, I encountered Master Yin while transporting medicine. She felt that I was talented and taught me the sword. I naturally owe her and the Bazinkendo ground this favor of rebirth." At this point, he looked up into Ding Ning's eyes and confirmed that Ding Ning was carefully listening to his words. Then he said, "But the disciple does not have to make the same choice as the master. Even if I had returned to the Bazinkendo ground in the past, it would have been useless. Master Yin would have died in battle, and the Bazenkindo ground would have been destroyed. Also, I do not think Master Yin did the right thing. I am a cultivator and learned from the Bazenkindo ground. But first, I am a soldier. In my view, the Holy One's ascension to the throne was a foregone conclusion. The change in the Bazenkindo ground is of no benefit to the Qin dynasty. Moing looked at Ding Ning, who listened carefully but did not react. He slowly looked up at the sky and said, "What I did was the same as what the Bazenkindo ground did in the past. I do not want to die for nothing. I want to see the Qin dynasty walk towards a more prosperous place. So in these years, I have not returned to Chongling to fight for power, and only served as a general on the border. Is everything that the Bazenkindo ground and your master did absolutely right?" Mo Ing said heavily. "Does the heir of Bazenkindo ground, who does not follow the ideas of the Bazenkindo ground, have to die?" His words were very powerful. In reality, many Chongling cultivation places, including some generals in the army, still sympathized with the Bazenkindo ground of the past. They revered Wang Jingming and felt that Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu's betrayal back then was a shameful betrayal. But these feelings were based on reason and righteousness. The revenge of the Bazenkindo ground had to be based on reason and righteousness. No one was strong enough to kill everyone in the world. If they could not obtain the recognition of the world, no revenge could succeed. Mo Ying's words were more powerful than the formation formed by the dozen cultivators. You are right. The heir of Bazenkindo ground, who does not follow the ideas of the Bazenkindo ground, do not have to die. But to everyone's surprise, including Mo Ying, Ding Ning nodded and said this. Even Zhongsun Qinxue was surprised and stilled. But the Bazenkindo ground's things must be taken back by the Bazenkindo ground. Ding Ning looked calmly at the stilled Mo Ying and continued. It is fine if you do not agree with Master. But if you obtain her things and reveal them to the enemy, you are betraying Master. You will be expelled from the sect, and the sword manuals she gave you will be taken back. Your cultivation will be destroyed. This is right. Ding Ning's voice slowly reverberated in the dead silent military camp. No one had any objections. Even Mo Ying's most loyal men of sacrifice could not raise any objections. Expulsion from the sect and destruction of cultivation were the lightest punishments. But for a powerful grandmaster like Mo Ying, destruction of cultivation, what did this mean? Mo Ying took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes. He looked at Zhongsun Qinxue and said in a cold voice, "The eldest miss of the Gongsun family cannot be considered a member of the former Bazenkindo ground. If you want to take the things of the Bazenkindo ground, then let the people of the Bazenkindo ground take them." Ding Ning smiled faintly. "I was supposed to take them." Chapter 574. The camp was silent. All the cultivators in the camp were certain that Ding Ning was not Realm 7, especially the cultivators who had allied with Zhongsun Qinxue. They were certain that Ding Ning's life-bond presence was very young. In other words, he had just reached Realm 6. The difference between Realm 6 and 7 was more terrifying than the difference between lower realms. Because Realm 7 was moving mountains, grandmasters, and enemies of tens of thousands. There were differences between Realm 7 grandmasters. For example, Liang Lian had lost to Shui Wangshu in the past. Zhao Zhan had died at Yi Xiling's hands. Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si could defeat most Realm 7s in the world. Some of the Realm 7 grandmasters at the Deer Mountain Conference had the power to kill multiple Realm 7s. Mo Ying was Realm 7. He was also a Realm 7 who had received the inheritance of the Bazenkindo ground. He was not a Realm 7 from an ordinary sect. Simply speaking, vital energy was different cultivation methods that refined and gathered primal energies of the universe. Sword manuals were different ways of using vital energy to kill enemies. There were differences in vital energy cultivation methods and killing methods. There were differences in Realm 7, and Mo Ying was in the middle. It was a lie for a Realm 6 to win against a Realm 7, much less a Realm 7. Yet when Ding Ning said this, no one in the camp found it laughable, because he was the Nine-Death Silkworm. He represented the legend of Wang Jingming. In the past, Wang Jingming had countless examples of winning against those with higher realms. Mo Ying used reason and righteousness to suppress. Ding Ning also used reason and righteousness. So Ding Ning's response, along with the presence of the 9-death silkworm that had turned from a legend to a living being, was even more powerful. Mo Ying's pupils contracted slightly. He looked at Ding Ning with some admiration. "You'll be the one collecting it?" Ding Ning did not repeat his previous words. His calm gaze landed on the sword in Mo Ying's hand. He said, "This sword belongs to the Bazin Kendo ground. Today, since I represent the Bazin Kendo ground to expel you, you must first return this sword to me." Mo Ying lowered his head slightly and looked at the dagger in his hand. After a moment of silence, he said, "The army is attacking, and the center is empty. Miss Gongsun is here. You have the confidence to kill me, but now you are the one to collect the debt. You take back this Bazin Kendo ground sword first. It is fair." After saying this, he raised his head and a gentle aura gushed out from his hand. It wrapped around the dagger and flew up, landing in front of Ding Ning. Ding Ning reached out and caught the short sword. "Ever since you told Zheng Xiu some of the secrets of the sword manual, you must have been afraid of being controlled, so you didn't have the confidence to use this sword, let alone refine this sword into your natal sword. That's why this sword is so dim. This sword is useless in your hands." Ding Ning looked with a complicated gaze at the sword in his hand. When he spoke, the sound of silkworms eating mulberry leaves sounded in his body. Heavy breathing sounded in the camp at the same time, forming a tide. There were no powerful primal energies of the universe vibrations, but pale, white light seeped out of Ding Ning's right arm that held the sword. The pale, white light was like a faint, watery light, and then turned tangible. Countless tiny streams came out of Ding Ning's skin under his robes, out of his clothes, and into the dim short sword in his hand. The sound of silkworms eating mulberry leaves grew clearer. Everyone looked at the vital energy streams. Their vision was limited, and they could not see the details. But even the soldiers in the camp, who were not cultivators, could sense from the sound that these streams were made from countless tiny silkworms. The eyes of the dozen or so cultivators who had formed the formation were filled with fear. Their emotions were surging. In the past in Chongling, everyone said that the 9-death silkworm had fallen into Wang Jingming's hands. But Wang Jingming had never shown the 9-death silkworm, so no one knew what the 9-death silkworm method was. Many people were certain that Wang Jingming did not cultivate the 9-death silkworm. This was the first time the 9-death silkworm had appeared in public. Even just seeing it was enough to create unimaginable waves in the hearts of these cultivators. When the 9-death silkworm appeared, the pale white streams clearly had a different quality from ordinary vital energy as they flooded into the seal scripts of the dim green short sword. The sword seemed to tremble in excitement, but in Ding Ning's hand, it was extremely stable. When all the white seal scripts on the sword were filled with the pale white light, the dim color melted like a thin layer of snow, quickly fading away. The light green short sword instantly blossomed with an astonishing brilliance, and the yuan qi flowing out of the sword turned into a rich yellow color, turning into yellow flowers that were extremely intense. The bright colors illuminated everyone's eyes. Even Ding Ning's figure, dressed in a dark gray robe, became dazzling and breathtaking. This sword is called Warm Spring. Ding Ning looked at this bright sword and slowly held it across his chest. His gaze was filled with colors. To him, this sword was also a reunion, so his emotions were definitely not calm. When Ding Ning took this sword, the sound of silkworms eating started to flow through his body. Mo Ying's expression grew unusually cold. Holding the sword across his chest meant an invitation to fight. This meant that the battle could start. The other was Realm 6, but that person's heir cultivated the 9-death silkworm. His emotions were fluctuating right now, and this was the best time for him to attack. So he did not hesitate and attacked. With an explosive sound, a strong life aura gushed out of his hand, and a long shadow appeared. Mo Ying naturally cultivated the sword, but the life bond item in his hand was a spear. It was a black spear that was emitting black smoke from its body. Red flames floated in the smoke, like flowers blooming in hell. Demon Dragon Spear. Zhang Sun Qinshue's gaze flashed, and she frowned. This was the weapon of the old Changgue family, and came from the remains of a sect of the Yu dynasty. Putting aside its significance, in terms of the energy gathered in the weapon, it was no less than the famed swords of the Bazin Kendo ground. Mo Ying held the spear with both hands. Small beads of blood flew out of his fingers. The powerful vital energy that had not erupted for many years caused the skin on his hands to crack. His expression was murderous. Just as the spear appeared in his hand, a wild presence charged towards Ding Ning. The sound of mountains moving sounded in the surrounding air. This was the sound caused by the vast amounts of primal energies of the universe when a mountain-moving realm grandmaster attacked. At the same time, the wild presence formed a real mountain that smashed down. Large amounts of invisible primal energies of the universe and the black smoke and red flames coming off the spear formed the shadow of a mountain, locking down any direction Ding Ning could dodge. The power of this mountain far surpassed the limits of Mo Ying's cultivation because Mo Ying's spear was a pry bar. A pry bar could naturally pry up a weight that should have been impossible to move. Ding Ning's clothes flapped. The enormous shadow was about to tear his clothes and body apart and crush them into powder. His emotions were fluctuating violently, but he did not panic. He followed his thoughts and passed his emotions to the sword. The sword style of his sword was reunion. A reunion after many years. Gratitude, hatred, and the weight of life and death. His emotions were extremely complicated. The streams flowing on the sword started to vibrate violently. The thick and beautiful sword in his hand started to vibrate violently. Chapter 575. The intense and complex vibrations caused this short sword to give off hundreds of sword energies of different colors. They flew up and faced the mountain shadow falling from the sky. The sword energies charged at the enormous shadow and exploded like fireworks at the bottom of the mountain shadow. The demon dragon spear in Mo Ying's hand started to vibrate. Then his body started to vibrate. His murderous eyes were instantly filled with an indescribable complexity. He instantly understood that this vibration did not come from the collision of true power. It was not that the power of Ding Ning's sword was strong enough to block his demon dragon Lever's Mountain, but because it came from the depths of his heart, his own emotions surging. The emotions brought about by the other party's sword intent were perfectly transmitted to his senses and spiritual world, affecting his heart. In this moment, he was like a flying sword that had been taken off course. He was unavoidably infected, and many scenes of their encounters appeared in his mind. It was as if this sword that had just left his hand had appeared in front of his eyes after many years. From there, he recalled the first time he encountered Yin Xinlan, the first time he saw this warm spring. That was a very warm spring. On a certain battlefield in the south, there were countless golden rapeseed blooming on the hills. He carried a bucket of blood-soaked bandages through the flower fields. There was a woman washing her face beside the clear stream that usually washed these bandages. That was Yin Xinlan. There were two swords at her waist on the left and right. One was Last Flower, the other was Warm Spring. Yin Xinlan was like the swordsman of the Bazin Kendo ground. The presence she gave off was like an extremely sharp sword. Yet the way she washed her face was different from ordinary women. She clearly sensed his arrival, but did not change her posture as she washed her face unhurriedly. Many years later, he knew that this was determination and also her stubbornness that would not change for outsiders. While he was stunned, Yin Xinlan turned her head and said unconcernedly, "Judging from your steps, breathing, and the strength you use when you carry this wooden bucket, you should have cultivated some of the cultivation methods of Huangcheng's Sword School and White Deer Academy. You have learned a variety of things and are not direct, but to be able to learn so much, you are a genius." He was stunned for a long time, not knowing what to feel. Finally, he said, "Then can you teach me?" She was non-committal, but in the end, she still taught him. The golden color that filled the sky and the scene of their encounter caused his mind to tremble. For a moment, he became absent-minded, and even absent-minded. This was enough for Ding Ning. A sword shadow brought Ding Ning out from under the shadow of the mountain. The shadow of the mountain fell behind him, and the ground exploded soundlessly. There was no time for any sound to be heard. Ding Ning had already broken Mo Ying's spear. Uncontrollable cries of surprise rang out like a tide as more tents were lifted. The cultivators in the barracks could not believe their eyes. They did not dare to believe that there was someone in the world who could disregard the rules of power and break such an attack just by using a move to counter another move. This is truly a miracle. Mo Ying took a deep breath. The turbulent emotions in his eyes disappeared. The tip of the spear fell to the ground. The remaining power on the tip easily broke through the vibrations coming from the ground and naturally removed any negative effects the energy vibrations had on his body and vital energy. He was not in a hurry to attack. He looked at Ding Ning and said expressionlessly, "In the past, Wang Jingming fought all the sects and was familiar with the moves of all sections. He did not just know how to use most moves in the world, but also defeat them. So he had the ability to fight above his realm. I had not expected you, his heir, to be able to do this." Ding Ning looked up slightly at the other's cold and murderous eyes. He did not respond to the other's words. He just raised his sword as though to let Mo Ying see more clearly. At the same time, he asked softly, "Have you ever thought why she took you as a disciple?" "Why?" Ding Ning's question did not immediately cause ripples in Mo Ying's mind. He had been preparing to attack all this time and was also preparing for Ding Ning to attack. At this time, Ding Ning attacked. He let go of the hilt. With a hiss, the dagger flew out of his hand. The extreme speed immediately caused the sword to become a faint shadow. But in the next moment, the trajectory of the sword and the sword essence it released caused this flying dagger to become even more ethereal. It seemed to disappear into the air, yet it carried an indescribable feeling. Like in the early summer, a person came to the willow tree at the maple bridge on a slightly tipsy night and happened to encounter a woman he had seen before and admired but did not know where she was. Ding Ning's sword displayed this feeling to the fullest. The name of this sword was Seeing Fate. Some things were called fate, which carried a solemn and serious flavor. Some things were called fate, which often carried a sweet and warm flavor, or a slight taste of sorrow. Mo Ying's spear gave off a great sound like a dragon's roar. As the great power in his body surged, the tip of the spear sprayed out a red flow hotter than lava. This spear was the demon dragon's roar, a secret move from the ancient cultivation land of the old nobility. It gave off the power of the legendary dragon's breath. The great spear presence was peerless, and the great sound carried the power to bewitch a cultivator's mind and perception. But at this moment, when his move started, he was unable to affect Ding Ning. Because of Ding Ning's previous words and the sword essence of Ding Ning's sword, his mind once again sank into a great shock. Subconsciously, he had already considered Ding Ning's question, but the answer was like a pebble in the water, brought to the surface by Ding Ning's sword essence. He was a very talented cultivator. Otherwise, even if he received the teachings of the Bazin Kendo ground, he could not have become so strong in such a short time. But Mo Ying, who understood Yin Xinlan and her personality, knew that Yin Xinlan would teach him the sword because she rarely left the Bazin Kendo ground and rarely interacted with people. She was also very young. Because she was young enough, when he asked her to teach him the sword, she had not thought of taking on a disciple and had not taken on a talented cultivator as a disciple. But even more importantly, because she was young enough, she believed in fate. On a spring day when she was in a good mood and flowers were blooming, she saw a pleasing young person, and then this shy and dumb young person asked her for advice on sword skills, so she taught him. This was fate. Was there anything else? If there was, then he was young enough at the time, so his eyes were clean. He had no desires or extravagant demands, and was just an ordinary medicine master. Mo Ying received the answer. His emotions fluctuated even more, and a hint of chaos appeared in the Mo dragon's roar. A light sword light pierced through the scarlet flames and landed on his forehead. He suddenly woke up and was slightly dazed. A hint of viciousness flashed through his brow. His left hand left the spear, and at this moment he caught the sword light with 2 fingers. There was a soft sound. The sword was like a slippery loach as it forced its way out of his fingers. His entire body slid backwards. The friction between the soles of his shoes and the ground made the same sound as the flying sword rubbing against his fingers. A sword mark appeared between his brows, so deep that bone could be seen. Blood flowed down the tip of his nose. This chapter reflected my feelings. I'm extremely satisfied with myself, so I'll give it a thumbs up. I am embarrassed to say that I went to the conference in Beijing and was not acclimatized. On the train back to Wuxi, I used a toilet on the high-speed rail. I almost became the first online great writer to cheat. This has happened twice. I feel my energy is hurt and weak. Chapter 576. Blood dripped onto the dust under Mo Ying's feet, blooming like plum blossoms in early spring. Mo Ying looked down at the blood and dust under his feet, silent as he held his spear with one hand. The wound on his forehead was not enough to affect his following battle, but it was enough to affect his mind. The dozen cultivators in front of Zhangsun Qinxue were the ones with the highest cultivation in this camp other than him. Even when facing an enemy like Zhangsun Qinxue, they were fearless and maintained absolute calmness. But when they saw the wound on his forehead, they were shocked, and some people's lips started to tremble. It was just a sword move. When there was a great difference between Mo Ying's vital energy cultivation and his, the other just used a sword move to create a wound on Mo Ying's forehead. The sword essence was too perfect. The sword move was exquisite and profound. But this young cultivator in black robes had reached an unimaginable level in the execution and interpretation of this sword move. It was enough for swordsmen like them to worship. Many of Chongling's old records had been burned after the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne. But at this time, they could not help but think of Wang Jingming's duel with a Zhao swordsman at the Calm Lake in the Zhao. Back then, Wang Jingming had only used one sword move for the other to see, and the other had admitted defeat. The Emperor of the Sword. All swords in the world could only worship him. Now that the 9-death silkworm had officially appeared in the light, that person who had died became real again. The countless invisible little silkworms in Ding Ning's body were released for the first time. They moved with unspeakable joy, and the soft sounds passed clearly into Mo Ying's ears. The short sword giving off bright color spun in circles around Ding Ning's body, creating dazzling streaks of light in the air, appearing wanton and arrogant. Sensing Ding Ning's calm presence, Mo Ying slowly said, "You want to establish dominance." His voice spread throughout the camp, and everyone immediately understood what he meant. Many years ago, news had spread in Chongling that the 9-death silkworm had appeared. Only Wang Jingming knew about the 9-death silkworm. It was unique. The appearance of the 9-death silkworm naturally represented his heir. In these years, the 9-death silkworm had always been hidden in the shadows, wandering between legend and reality, making it difficult to distinguish between reality and illusion. But since it was going to appear, regardless of whether it was an invincible method like the 9-death silkworm or the heir of the once invincible Bazin Kendo ground legend, the way and time of appearance would not be mediocre. Beating an opponent like Mo Ying, who was of a higher realm, was the best way. Back then, many people stood against the Bazin Kendo ground simply because that person was dead, and they believed that he had no successor. When it was confirmed that this person had left behind a successor who was as powerful as the previous person, many people might change their way of doing things. Defeat me. Announce the official return of the 9-death silkworm, and start to take back the things of the Bazin Kendo ground. Let the world know. This is the true meaning of this battle. Mo Ying slowly looked up. Looking at Ding Ning, who did not respond, he shook his head. But you have to first defeat me. I do not believe that moves can surpass cultivation. When he spoke, the tip of his spear left the ground and flew up. His body seemed to be lifted up by the demon dragon's spear and flew with the spear towards Ding Ning. He did not release much vital energy. The primal energies of the universe rumbled in the surrounding air, and all of them surged into his body and the spear in his hand. He became one with the spear and charged towards Ding Ning in a domineering and simple manner. There were no moves, just a collision and a crushing. When everything was simple to the extreme, it was harder to defeat. Seeing him attack, Ding Ning naturally knew the danger. But there was no ripple in his eyes. He had even predicted that Mo-ing would attack like this, because he was not the person that Mo-ing and the other people in the camp thought he was. He had experienced that Mo-ing and these people did not imagine, and had faced many similar situations. So he had prepared for this. Pew 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 in the air around him, the flying sword brought out streaks of bright and dazzling light, and then sword light burst out at the same time. The paper-thin sword lights stuck close to each other and spun rapidly, like thousands of small swords spinning at the same time. The sword light spun around his body and completely wrapped around him. The sword light spun in one direction. In this moment, they looked like an enormous spinning top and also a stone mill. The black spear tip spewing out red flames fiercely collided with the rotating sword light. The sword light wrapped around Ding Ning's body and kept on retreating, but the spear tip could not advance. The sword light ground against the spear tip. The red flames and black smoke at the tip spread, and countless golden stars appeared. Stone grinding sword art. Among the dozen or so cultivators who had formed the formation, some of them were finally unable to control their emotions and cried out in surprise. Mo Ying's lips were pressed into a line. The demon dragon spear in his hand started to vibrate. This time it was not just because he was excited, but because of the friction of power. Like the 9-death silkworm, the stone-grinding sword art was Wang Jingming's symbol. The stone-grinding sword art was known as the sword manual with the best defense in the world, and the one that could grind people to death. In the past, when Wang Jingming encountered opponents with stronger vital energy than him, he used this sword manual to kill them. In all of the Bazenkendo ground, he was the only one who had mastered this sword manual. This sword manual was related to the fine control of the flow of countless sword lights, like inscribing countless seal scripts in an instant. Now, the stone-grinding sword art had reappeared, and his simple demon dragon spear attack could not advance. This attack did not just defeat his move, but also his confidence. Amidst the sword light and flying fire, a mouthful of blood surged into Ding Ning's throat. But Ding Ning viciously swallowed this mouthful of blood. At the same time, the fingers of his left hand moved again as though he was pulling on invisible strings. Multiple thread-like sword lights appeared behind Mo-ing and attacked multiple meridian points on his back. Mo-ing suddenly woke up and gave a strange shout. The spear was still locked in a stalemate, but he was flying into the air. Puff, puff, puff. Several streaks of blood gushed out from his feet, and a few more wounds appeared. Ding Ning looked up. At this moment, his calm eyes blossomed with extreme anger. The flying sword spinning around him accelerated explosively. It did not look like a flying sword, but an enormous stick flying in the air, chasing after Mo-ing, who had become a black dot in the air. This attack was called Heaven's Fury. This sword strike of his also walked the path of pure strength. His vital energy surged out of his body, guiding the primal energies of the universe from all directions. The countless little silkworms in his body surged furiously and spat out the power they contained. Streams of 9-death silkworms erupted into the air, like silk reaching into the sky. How is this possible? The cultivators in the camp looked up at the sky. They opened their mouths, but could not breathe, like fish about to die. They could not understand why Ding Ning would use such a sword move. There were countless ways to chase, but Ding Ning's attack was purely based on brute power. No matter how strong a Realm 6 was, what advantage could he have against a Realm 7? Mo Ying's lips twitched slightly. The sword silks had cut off several tendons and muscles on his feet, and the intense pain made him feel a little dizzy. Sensing the sword coming from below, Mo-ing turned this pain he had not experienced for a long time into an angry shout. With a thunderous shout, he held the spear with both hands and smashed it down. The black spear bent and then straightened. With a boom, the enormous power hit the flying sword coming from under his feet. Chapter 577. A jet-black yuan chi blossomed like a real demonic dragon. The yuan chi bursting out from the spear and the flying sword formed a dazzling halo that rapidly expanded outwards. Ding Ning suddenly fell down. With a grunt, as the ground caved in, a bloody mist sprayed out of his skin. The bones in his body cracked, and his body almost disintegrated. Yet the countless little silkworms swimming freely in his body stubbornly swallowed most of the energy that flooded into his body, and even endured most of the vibrations and impacts to support his body. In the sky above his head, under the rapidly expanding halo, the bright flying sword had just been pushed back dozens of feet. But at this moment, with a muffled groan, a new power was injected into it, and it started to accelerate. This sword's acceleration carried a hint of madness. Because the acceleration was so great, the tail of the sword started to sway naturally and made terrifying sounds as it disturbed the air. Mo Ying's spear was still moving downwards. A disdainful smile had just appeared at the corner of his mouth. In his view, this head-on clash would naturally end with Ding Ning being seriously wounded. Yet when the sword's movements appeared clearly in his perception, the corners of his eyes twitched slightly. Ding Ning was faster than him in this attack. His vital energy was still vibrating. The spear was still moving, but Ding Ning's second attack had arrived. It was so fast that he did not have time to think clearly about how to respond or feel anger and shock. He could only withdraw his spear. He had to withdraw his spear in order to block Ding Ning's attack. The demon dragon spear suddenly collapsed, turning into a thick ball of black energy. It forcibly stopped moving, and then turned solid again to attack. An explosive sound rang out in the sky. Ding Ning's flying sword did not truly fly towards him. It only stabbed towards the air above him, creating a straight path that was faster than the speed of sound. This sound of explosion came from the sky after the flying sword started to slow down. Mo Ying's spear missed, and his body seemed to have been hollowed out. He bent forward and vomited blood. Ding Ning's attack was a feint and forced him to withdraw his spear. The great power was withdrawn and collided with the power coming out of his body. It was like two cultivators of the same cultivation as him were fighting inside his body. Sonic booms resounded in the air, accompanied by visible shockwaves that looked like giant dandelions. Mo Ying's body fell down, and he coughed up blood. The dozen cultivators in the camp stopped breathing. They knew that Ding Ning had been seriously wounded in just now. But clearly, Mo Ying was more seriously wounded. He could not even attack while Ding Ning's flying sword was still in the air. This was exchanging injury for injury. But Ding Ning still won. Ding Ning's eyebrows rose, and he took a deep breath. Even though he had many similar experiences, fighting above his cultivation level was like walking on a cliff, and had many unpredictable dangers. Only now did this battle truly enter his time. As he inhaled, his eyes instantly turned deep red. The reverse blood in his body and some chaotic energies were attracted by his vital energy threads and started to burn. Boom! His body sank down like a hammer, and some of the 9-death silkworm's power was forced out of his body and merged with the primal energies of the universe caused by the burning of his energies. The black clothes on his body instantly turned pale white, as if there was a layer of pale, white waves moving around his body. A vast sword essence appeared in the sky. The warm spring sword, which had been extremely bright in color, turned into a burning sun. The entire camp was illuminated by the bright and blazing light. It was so white that no one could see any light with their eyes. Mo Ying shouted and closed his eyes. His hand did not tremble, but the tip of the spear had moved countless times in an instant. The pitch-black spear tip was like a torrential rain, meeting the scorching sun of the sword above him. This was one of the secret swords of the Bazin Kendo ground. Burning Sunday, the sword energy formed many mirrors and gathered the heat of true sunlight. The blinding light was just the surface. The true power came from the terrifying heat contained in the rays of light pointed by the sword essence. Yet when he used his spear move, the sword in his perception immediately disappeared. His perception turned to darkness. After the extreme brightness, It was often the deepest darkness caused by the instantaneous contrast. Ding Ning's powerful burning sun was just a feint. Mo Ying's heart beat violently. As his blood expanded, the true sense of death that came to his body for the first time forced out the potential in his body. In that split second, he finally sensed a faint trace of a shadow. Both of his hands glowed brightly. From deep inside the jade palace in his chi vessel, an extremely pure stream of energy burst out from his palms. He turned the end of the spear horizontally and smashed towards this faint shadow like holding a spoon. At this time, he heard a sound that should not have appeared. This was the sound of an enormous mountain moving in the sky. This sound was the symbol of Realm 7, Mountain Moving Realm. It was the sound produced when vast amounts of primal energies of the universe moved through the void, collided and landed. Yet at this time, other than him and Ding Ning, the other cultivators in the camp did not move. This amount of energy was clearly something that only a Realm 7 could activate. If it wasn't him, then who could it be? This moment was too fast. Just as this puzzling thought appeared in his mind, the end of his gun had already smashed into the faint shadow hidden behind the light. The faint shadow shattered like a cicada's wing. Cicada slough. The name of this sword move washed away all the thoughts in Mo Ying's mind. In the next moment, he felt his body sink. Then he instinctively looked towards his energy sea. A wave of energy was charging out of his abdomen in layers, flashing with bright red light. Then he heard a soft pop from his back. A cold presence pierced through his flesh and flew out of his back. The demon dragon spear in his hand suddenly became heavier than a mountain. With a bang, the spear fell to the ground in front of him and created a cloud of dust. Mo Ying stood absent-mindedly. He felt his body was empty. It turned out that the sword that followed after the scorching sun was not the real killing move. It was actually followed by the cicada slew, but it was not Realm 7. Why did the last attack have the power of a Realm 7? The last attack. When the words clearly appeared in his mind, he started to feel pain and coldness. He let out a miserable cry. The scream sounded strange. Even he felt that he was not the one who had shouted it. Ding Ning stood with his hands behind his back and stopped. Because of the rapid blood loss and the lack of vital energy, Mo Ying's flesh had caved in. His face appeared to age in an instant, and even his cheeks were sunken like two balls of shadow. Ding Ning felt pleasure. His gaze fell on the colorful, smoky sword that was flying freely behind him. "I am taking back what is on the Bazinkindo ground," he said slowly. Chapter 578. This voice echoed in the camp and cut at people's hearts like small files. The dozen cultivators in the formation were silent. One of the cultivators looked at the scene and suddenly thought of many years ago in Chongling. One evening, his master pointed at a certain cultivation place and smiled disdainfully. He said, "That cultivation place is dead." He did not understand. That cultivation place had many disciples and was living well. "The soul is gone." His master had replied to him with these words. At the time, he had not understood. Only a long time later did he know that his master's "soul is gone" represented the rules of a sect and the spirit of a sect. If this sect did not have something the cultivators would protect with their lives, then this sect had died. The Bazinkindo ground sect was gone. But today, the 9-death silkworm had appeared. The other used such a method to take back what belonged to the Bazinkindo ground. Even if the Bazinkindo ground only had one heir left, the rules were still there, and the soul was still there. What was most important was the human heart. Ding Ning put away the colorful sword and hung it at his waist. He and Zhangsun Qinxue did not say anything else and did not care about other people's expressions. They silently walked out of the camp. Mo Ying fell face first into the dust. There were many death soldiers around him, but when they saw him fall, no one came forward. The entire camp sank into a strange silence. Only when Ding Ning and Zhangsun Qinxue completely disappeared from their sight did a young soldier run to Mo Ying's side and start to apply medicine on him. This was a young medicine master. He was slightly panicked. Looking at the wound on Mo Ying's abdomen, he instinctively sprinkled medicine to stop the bleeding, and then did not dare to sew it up. Mo Ying's breathing started to become disordered. He looked at this young medicine master and naturally thought of his past self. He seemed to have become that medicine master from many years ago who did not know how to cultivate. But now he had become like this. He looked at the sword wound on his abdomen, and his flesh that was rapidly aging due to the loss of vital energy and primal energies of the universe. His exposed skin was like the old leather used to sharpen weapons in the army. He suddenly felt that it was funny. He laughed bitterly and loudly. "It's like a joke," he said to the hesitant and terrified young apothecary. The young pharmacist was stunned. He didn't know what he meant and became even more flustered. "Do you know what my biggest mistake was?" Mo Ying looked at the young pharmacist and asked seriously. The young pharmacist didn't dare to respond. Of course he didn't know. "The biggest mistake I made was knowing that I wasn't one of the top people in the world, but I still wanted to stand among them. Only when you make a mistake will you start to be afraid." Mo Ying looked seriously at this young pharmacist like he was looking at his closest junior. He said sincerely, "People have to know their own weight. Be a good doctor, don't learn the sword." The young pharmacist didn't know why he said this, and didn't know how to respond. He instinctively nodded, and did not detect that Mo Ying's gaze had landed on the sword hanging by his waist. He was not a cultivator, but he would fight when necessary in the army, so he was also equipped with an ordinary iron sword. Mo Ying reached out towards this iron sword. The young pharmacist was shocked. He realized what Mo Ying was going to do. But even though Mo Ying had lost his cultivation and was weak from blood loss, he still had all the memories and experience of a grandmaster. There was a soft sound. The young pharmacist's face was dyed red with blood. His hand landed on empty air. Mo Ying had already pulled out the sword at his waist and cut down on his own neck. "Ah!" The young pharmacist screamed, his mind blank. His scream spread so far that Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue, who were far from the camp, heard it. Zhang Sun Qinxue guessed what had happened, but she did not feel much pleasure. The pleasure of revenge usually lasted for a short time. Most of the time, revenge would make one think of many unhappy memories. How is it? She was just worried about Ding Ning's wounds. Ding Ning still had the strange elixir of immortality from the Wuji ancestral mountain in his body. "I feel very good." Ding Ning looked honestly at her and said softly, "I finally stopped rusting. If you don't do some things, you will forget that feeling. In reality, I am not as strong as before." Zhang Sun Qinxue nodded and said, "Since you have revealed your identity as the Nine-Death Silkworm, you do not need to hide your attacks. You will quickly recover. Using the sword is just an instinct for you." Ding Ning nodded. He raised his head and looked at the eastern sky. In the distant horizon, there were many black dots flying up and down. Those black dots were vultures. Where there were many vultures, it meant large amounts of death. In the Yin Mountain area, on the Qin and Chu borders, the armies of the two sides were tightly entangled. There were many battles every day. Other than this, the fiercest fighting was naturally Yangshan Commandery. Yangshan Commandery had been seated and ruled by the Chu for many years. While it had been forcibly taken back by the Qin dynasty before the Deer Mountain Conference, the Chu dynasty armies were far more familiar with Yangshan Commandery than the Qin army. There were large numbers of Chu people in many cities. These Chu people had lived in Yangshan Commandery for many years. Many of them were even married to Qin people. Even though Yangshan Commandery had been forcibly taken back by the Qin dynasty, there had not been fierce fighting in most cities. So the living conditions of these people had not changed much. However, no one expected that a cold military order would soon be passed to Yangshan County. Investigate the household register. The household register system had been one of the important parts of the Shang reform in the past. It could avoid the problems of unpaid wages, tax evasion, and bandits that had troubled the Qin dynasty in the past. Some cultivators from other dynasties found it difficult to hide in Chongling for long periods of time because of this. All the Chu people in Yangshan Commandery were investigated. Then they were gathered and driven away. In the next few days, more than 70,000 Chu people were forcibly driven away. They were escorted by the Qin army towards the Chu dynasty, or rather, towards the battlefield. These Chu people, regardless of age, only carried some rations when they left their homes. They did not receive any supplies along the way. Each day, this enormous group of Chu refugees were driven forward like an army. Many days later, large numbers of weak people in this group could not bear it and started to die. The vultures usually traveled in groups of a dozen. In Yangshan Commandery, more and more vultures smelled the scent of death and followed this group. Chapter 579. The weather in spring was unpredictable, sometimes warm and sometimes cold. It was easy to get sick at this time, and for the exiled people, it was a nightmare. The situation of the Chu refugees, who were forced to move daily under the escort of the army, was even more difficult than that of ordinary refugees. Not only did they not have food and medicine, they also did not have enough rest. After a small number of deaths, as a large number of infected people appeared, a large number of deaths were inevitable. From the start, when the order to expel all the Chu people from Yangshan Commandery was given, this was fated to be a cruel massacre. From a certain point of view, using this method to kill these ordinary people was crueler than massacring a city. This cruel order came from the Chongling Imperial Palace, from Empress Zhengxiu. In the dark Chongling Imperial Palace, in the long corridor outside the Empress study, many officials were kneeling. These officials had come to ask the Empress to take back the order. In their view, no matter which dynasty in history, too cruel a rule would only lead to early destruction. Even if it was some methods against the enemy, the reputation of cruelty would cause the people of this dynasty to feel insecure. But these officials understood Empress Zhengxiu too well, and knew words could not move her, so they used silence and hunger strikes. Zhengxiu sat in front of the desk. The door to her study was tightly shut. She could not directly see the expressions of these officials, but her powerful perception allowed her to clearly know the state of each official kneeling outside. Her perfect face that shone with a porcelain light had a hint of disdain. Her indifference and mockery were not because she did not care about these people's opinions at all. She felt that these people were dispensable or too lowly. Instead, it was because these people could not fathom her intentions at all. They did not understand that some things were originally her little tricks. Starting from the Min Mountain sword trials, in the view of outsiders, she seemed to have encountered too many failures and lost the halo of never failing. But everything was going according to her intentions. As long as she could reach the final goal, the process was not important. Like two chess players playing chess, one player seemed to have lost many pieces, but the overall situation had been set up. Starting from killing those 3 family members and taking complete control of Jiaodong Commandery, she started to truly place pieces. Driving away the Chu people in Yangshan Commandery was another one of her pawns. She had begun her true counterattack. The order was supposed to be withdrawn, but when it was withdrawn was a matter of opportunity. At the right time, it could be transformed into a killing move. The most important thing was the human heart. Everyone has feelings. Wasn't any kind of killing ultimately a killing of emotions? Using troops is inferior. Attacking the heart is superior. The officials outside the study had been kneeling for a day and a night. Some of the older officials were already nearing their limits. For her, if she walked out now, she could get the result they wanted in exchange for their gratitude. At the same time, she could also make them feel more reverent, knowing that they had to pay a sufficient price in exchange for her consent. If he were to encounter such a situation in the future, he would at least do so. She stood up, and the trace of mockery on her face completely disappeared. Expressionlessly, she walked through the spirit spring and pushed open the door to the study. I can take back my order, but I have a request. Without any superfluous words, she looked at the kneeling officials and calmly spoke with a powerful majesty. All the officials raised their heads at the same time. She continued, "Help me spread the word through Chongling. If you want me to not exile the Chu people in Yangshan Commandery, you have to have a Chu person of enough weight to trade. In other words, if you want to save the lives of the Chu people, you have to use the life of a Chu person of enough weight to trade." These officials were happy at first, but in the next moment, they felt a chill in their hearts because of the coldness in her words. Many people were already close to their limits, and now their bodies were as cold as ice. What if no Chu person of enough weight to stand up? One of the leading officials couldn't help but ask in a trembling voice. That is the Chu people's matter. Zheng Xiao shook her head and looked at the speaking official. If even the Chu people can sit by and watch, then what do the Qin have to worry about? This official stilled and could not speak. Can you have those Chu people stop first? An official took a deep breath and asked Zheng Xiao. He knew that there could not be no Chu people hiding around Chongling. But in the present situation, with each passing day, large numbers of people would die in the banished troop. That is also something the Chu people need to consider, Zheng Xiao said coolly. If they stand up one day later, more people will die. So I hope that those who can use their lives to trade for these people's lives will not hesitate. Hearing her words, many of the kneeling officials couldn't help but become angry again. However, they had nothing to say, because this was the method she was most used to. Many years ago, she had used this tactic more than once. Shameless but effective. This decree was quickly passed out. No one doubted the authenticity of her decree. This was her promise to all these officials, unless she could lose all of them. When this decree spread through Chongling, all the cultivators on the turrets in Chongling raised their guard in fear of missing any detail. Even if they were fated to die, the Chu people with enough weight could do crazy things. But they did not have time to see a Chu person walk out of an alley. This person came from the depths of the Imperial Palace. Deep in the Imperial Palace, there were multiple streams that led to the nearest river outside the Imperial Palace. The source of the streams were several square wells. There were many clothes, blankets, and other items that needed to be washed next to the wells. When the decree reached here, through word of mouth, a very old palace attendant put down the dirty clothes she was washing and slowly stood up. No one noticed her abnormality. Only when she walked out of the gates of this courtyard and walked in a direction she would not normally walk did some people wake up. When she did not seem to hear them after several shouts, the people who were shouting at her, including some of the palace cultivators who happened to see her along the way, started to realize that she might be related to the Empress' decree. Sharp alarms sounded in the Imperial Palace. This palace maid's clothes were very dirty and gave off an indescribably unpleasant smell. Her hair was also very messy, and her eyes were bright at this moment. She gave people the impression that she was only 40 years old, but her face was at least 50 years old. After the warnings were useless, a flying sword finally appeared in front of her, turning into a cold flame that went straight for her heart. This palace attendant smiled slightly. She simply smoothed her hair. While she was leisurely combing her hair, she caught the flying sword between her fingers and flicked it away as if it was a strand of hair that had fallen out of her head. With a seemingly careless movement, this flying sword pierced through the hearts of many guards along the way and then cut off the head of the master of the flying sword. Since you have come to accept orders, why kill? Do you not fear that I will find an excuse? When the head fell to the ground with hot blood, a cold and authoritative voice sounded at the end of the path in front of this palace attendant. This was Empress Zheng Xiao's voice. If I do not kill, how can I make you understand I have enough weight? This palace attendant looked up and saw Zheng Xiao, who had come quickly. She laughed. But you are in a hurry to speak with me. Do you fear I will die too quickly? Chapter 580. Zheng Xiao frowned slightly. Those familiar with her knew that this was a sign of her great displeasure. Powerful presences bloomed in the surrounding alleys of the imperial city. Countless cultivators were gathered here, including some Realm 7 cultivators who had never shown their cultivation in Chongling before. This was the center of the Qin dynasty. No matter how high this palace attendant's cultivation was, she could not leave. But her smile contained terrifying confidence, a kind of detachment from life and death. Zheng Xiao disliked this expression even more. She did not look at the palace attendant's face and stained clothing. She looked up slightly and said in a cold voice, "At the New Year banquet in the 12th year of Yuanwu, I had a personal palace attendant called Li Wanju." Her voice was not loud, but it was exceptionally clear, entering the ears of many people in the alleys of the imperial city. Almost everyone felt a chill run down their spines. Most of them did not know the name of that palace attendant, but they knew which palace attendant Jing Xiu was speaking of. That year, at the banquet of the Yuanwu Emperor's officials, a palace attendant had praised the imperial son Fu Su in front of everyone. The praise was that Fu Su's talent was very similar to that person. These words naturally implied that Fu Su was the son of Jing Xiu and that person. Even more importantly, while that palace attendant's body had been completely crushed by Yuanwu's powerful primal energies of the universe, she had committed suicide. To say such words at the Yuanwu Emperor's banquet with her own life and mention the past was not as simple as causing people's hearts to turn cold. That palace attendant is my disciple. The old palace attendant understood Jing Xiu's meaning and said directly with a smile. After that matter, the Divinity Bureau has been investigating Li Wanju and found many secrets about her, including the fact that her original sect was fake and the people connected to her. I always suspected that there was a powerful cultivator behind her, Jing Xiu said coldly. But I had not expected that person to be in the palace. I had not expected that person to be from the Chu. I had not expected that such a great grandmaster would be willing to wash dirty clothes for so many years. Jing Xiu is indeed Jing Xiu. She was able to tell that Li Wanju's cultivation method and mine have something in common just by looking at some of my qi. The old palace attendant's smile grew fainter. She said, "It seems that you still care about Yuanwu's feelings. Otherwise, why would you spend so much effort to investigate a palace attendant while remaining silent?" Jing Xiu said expressionlessly, "As a wife, I naturally have to care about my husband's feelings." The old palace maid laughed like a man. "As a wife? Whose wife were you before? Do you need to care about anyone's feelings?" Jing Xiu's expression did not change, but her jade-like fingers stiffened at this moment. "You're just scared." The old palace maid looked disdainfully at her. "What are you scared of? Is Fu Su really his son?" When the old palace maid said this, the air in the imperial city inexplicably stilled. Many suppressed inhales sounded in the senses of these cultivators. You like to play with people's hearts too much. But do not forget, everyone has feelings. Yuanwu is a person, and you are a person. The old palace maid laughed again. She looked at her and said, "Playing with fire too much will lead to self-destruction. You probably regret forcing a Chu person to come out and die, but you did not expect to force out someone related to Li Wanju. I have to thank you for giving me a chance to say these words in front of these people. Also, I do not mind telling you, while I am from the Chu, Li Wanju you have investigated for so many years. You should know that she is from the Qin, from Chongling. Moreover, she deliberately said those words at the banquet, not because of my instructions, but because of her own choice. Just like today, I walked out on my own, not because of anyone else's instructions, but because of my own choice." Jing Xiu was silent. She was thinking of something. In the end, she bowed her head slightly and looked at the palace maid. She asked, "Who are you?" The old palace maid thought for a moment, as though she needed to think of how to describe her identity. Many breaths later, she said, "I am from the Chu, and also from the Bazin Kendo ground. At the same time, I was once the teacher of the former consort Zhao, the present Empress Dowager of the Chu dynasty." The atmosphere in the imperial city became even heavier. These identities were too astounding. Jing Xiu's eyebrows rose slightly. She said, "In this case, Consort Zhao counts as someone from the Bazin Kendo ground. The Empress Dowager of the Chu dynasty is from the Bazin Kendo ground. I wonder what the Chu people think. Some things, there is a great difference between admitting and not admitting. Some things are well known." The old palace maid laughed again and said, "Just like you. You are clearly Wang Jingming's woman. I don't know how many times you have done it with him, but you stole Yuanwu and pretended to be pure. Does everyone in the world not know this, but not many dare to say it out loud?" These words were vicious and vulgar, but the old palace maid felt it was not enough. She said, "If you had not slept with Wang Jingming before betraying him, would you fear others saying that Fu Su is his son?" Jing Xiu slowly turned around. This meant that she did not need to speak with this old palace maid and did not want to see this person again. But at this moment, the old palace maid spoke again and said coolly, "When shamelessness reaches a certain level, you do not care about the process. only the final result. You do not care how others see you, how they talk about you behind your back. In the end, you sat on the throne of the Empress, controlled Jiaodong Commandery, controlled Chongling. In the end, Wang Jingming died, and I died here. But today, I stood out to die for the Chu. In the future, more people will stand up and die for the Chu. This is why I am willing to die here. After saying this, when the powerful cultivators in the imperial city released their killing intent, the old palace made released her vital energy and primal energies of the universe. She did not turn them into destructive power and killing intent. She released them as far as possible into the sky as beautiful light. There was a deafening boom. Her body disappeared like the palace attendant who had disappeared at the banquet. The vibrations came from multiple waves of murderous intent attacking her at the same time. Her vital energy and primal energies of the universe had turned into rainbow light. Everyone in Chongling looked in shock in the direction of the imperial city. A colorful beam of light shot into the clouds above, as if it had pierced a big hole in the sky. The scattered radiance was like countless colorful butterflies rushing out of the clouds, scattering outwards. In the eyes of ordinary people, this was a strange sight, but in the eyes of cultivators, this was a grandmaster burning her cultivation. In some inconspicuous corners of Chongling, there were some ordinary people who silently watched this unusual scene and then bowed their heads in greeting. Chapter 581. This old palace attendant had been nameless her entire life. But as Zheng Xiu's orders spread through Chongling, as it was related to the deaths of tens of thousands of Chu people, not just her deeds, but even her disciple, the palace attendant Li Wanzhu, whose name only the high officials of the Divinity Bureau knew, was once again mentioned by the people of the world. Some people's deaths won fame. Some were records in the world of cultivators, but some people's deaths won more than that. When the news of the old palace attendant hiding in the Qin dynasty's imperial palace, standing out in exchange for the lives of the 70,000 Yangshan commandery Chu people spread to the Chu, countless people in the Chu territory held a memorial ceremony for this palace attendant. Many Chu people even set up memorial tablets for this old palace attendant and worshipped her like a god. For the army, this old palace attendant's death was an indescribable power. The armies of the Qin dynasty were famed for their bravery, but in the many battles that occurred in the Chu, almost all of the Chu troops were braver and more fearless than the Qin troops. The most famous was the Battle of Yin Mountain Fort Deng. Fort Deng had more than 1,000 Chu soldiers, and a small half of them were the residents of Fort Deng who did not train much. But they encountered 20,000 Qin troops that had taken a detour to attack a supply route. This was a battle of mantises trying to stop a chariot. But these 1,000 Chu soldiers managed to stop the Qin army's multiple charges. Even though they were all killed in the end, no one fled. Each time the Qin army charged, all of the surviving Chu soldiers would respond with scornful laughter. Is your imperial son, Fu, Su Wang Jingming's son, or Yuanwu's son? Even if they could not defeat you, they would spit a mouthful of bloody saliva on your face. This was the spirit of the Qin people. But now it was the Chu peoples. What made the Qin army even more uncomfortable was that they could only be angry, but could not argue with the other on this issue. They could not dwell on this issue. Even many high-ranking Qin generals did not think that driving away the Yangshan commandery Chu people and forcing out such a grandmaster was Zheng Xiu's counterattack. They thought that Zheng Xiu had made another wrong move. Who is that old palace maid? When Zhangsun Qinshua looked at Ding Ning and asked, Ding Ning and the old monk who had been following Ding Ning were only a few hills away from Fort Deng. Before this, Ding Ning had already predicted that such an army would take this route, but they were still too slow. Fort Deng had already been razed to the ground. It was like this. Even if some things were calculated clearly, it would still be too late. Although some cultivators were powerful, it was impossible for them to decide the outcome of a war with their cultivation alone. Ding Ning's expression was somewhat complicated as he said, "She is indeed Consort Zhao's master. In terms of seniority, she is my sect aunt. Ironically, She was originally placed in the imperial palace by the Bazin Kendo ground to protect Yuanwu. While she is from the Chu, she has always been learning the sword in the Bazin Kendo ground. Zhongsun Qinxuan knew this history well. When the reform started and the Bazin Kendo ground protected Yuanwu against the other princes, many people wanted to kill Yuanwu. There are rumors that she is already dead. Ding Ning looked at Zhongsun Qinxue and added, "Even now, it seems that the rumors back then were just an illusion created by her, and she can only hide deeper." "What about Li Wanju, that palace maid?" Zhongsun Qinxue took a deep breath and asked. In the past, she only cared about her cultivation level and did not care about the many things that happened in the wine shop in Chongling. But when she learned of Ding Ning's true identity, she changed greatly. She remembered clearly that Ding Ning had her use some methods to slightly change Fu Su's appearance. In reality, there were very few cultivators who could do that. Other than cultivation level and method, the cultivator who did it had to be familiar with Wang Jingming's appearance in the past and remember it deeply. Only then could they make Fu Su have some similarities to Wang Jingming's appearance. When Ding Ning had her do this, she only felt that Ding Ning was using his friendship with Fu Su and felt it was malicious. But when the palace maid was mentioned again, she thought of how that palace maid was willing to give up her life just to say some insinuations in court. Then Ding Ning's viciousness should be related to that palace maid's death. Li Wanju is an orphan. She once had a sick younger brother. When I first came to Chongling, she and her brother were begging on the streets. At the time, a commoner wanted to use her brother's medical fees to threaten her to be a concubine. Later, I casually killed that commoner and then gave that person's wealth to her to manage. Ding Ning was silent for a moment. Later, I did not have any interactions with her. I did not even know when she became Zheng Xiu's attendant. Naturally, it was to repay the favor. Zhongsun Qinxue was silent for a moment. She rarely thought with her heart, but if she did, she could easily see some problems. She purposely said those words at the banquet not just to make Yuanwu more suspicious of Zheng Xiu, but also to tell the world that Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu are not so close. This is the conclusion she reached after staying in the imperial palace for many years. With her life as the guide, she cannot be wrong. You and I understand Zheng Xiu very well. Ding Ning nodded, but had an unusually serious expression. Since she can guess from Li Wanju that my sect and is not dead, then she does not fear what will happen next. The more Yuanwu cares, the crazier she acts. This means that she has started to counterattack. After a pause, he looked at Zhongsun Qinxue, who was frowning deeply, and said softly, "She will not let go of the 70,000 Chu people in Yangshan Commandery. The Chu dynasty will not ignore those Chu people. She wants to force the Chu dynasty to quickly decide the battle in Yangshan Commandery." So the battle in Yangshan Commandery is most likely the key to victory? Zhongsun Qinxue easily understood Ding Ning's meaning and said, "Then we need to go to Yangshan Commandery as soon as possible." "We do not need to go. The 9-Death Silkworm is in the Een Mountain area and will distract more powerful cultivators." Ding Ning shook his head. "But we cannot let her know our exact whereabouts. So we need to cut off all military communication with Wuji. What is it that gives you such confidence?" After speaking to Zhongsun Qinxue, Ding Ning looked at the ruins of Fort Deng in the distance. Such a voice sounded in his mind. He understood Zheng Xiu too well. So, just from Zheng Xiu's actions, he could sense Zheng Xiu's strong confidence in this battle. It was like a powerful predator's desire to devour its prey. Some of his guesses were very accurate. At this time, shameless things were happening in Yangshan Commandery. The Qin army that had been escorting the 70,000 Chu people quickly retreated after receiving orders from Chongling. Back then, Zheng Xiu had promised those officials that as long as there were enough Chu people to die in their place, she would not exile the Chu people of Yangshan Commandery. Now, the Qin army was quickly retreating, leaving these 70,000 Chu people without food and medicine in the desolate plains. Because the flames of war had already swept through, many areas of Yangshan Commandery were deserted. This group of 70,000 Chu refugees had been driven through Yangshan Commandery for many days. Now, they only had two choices. They could walk for many more days to return to their homes, or move towards Chu lands. However, based on the current situation of this team, it was impossible for them to do so with their own strength, unless there were Chu troops with enough food to receive them. Chapter 582. Most of the Qin soldiers escorting the Chu people of Yangshan Commandery were from Fenghe province. Most of these soldiers had been stationed along the Wu Mountain and were familiar with the situation around Yangshan Commandery. From every angle, even in the intelligence reports of the Qin dynasty's warden's office, the commander of Yangshan Commandery was Feng Qilan. But the true commander of the 600,000 Qin soldiers around Yangshan Commandery and the Wu Mountain was Wei Wujiu. Wei Wujiu's subordinates were all fighting around the Yin Mountain. Even in the intelligence reports to Fu Su and some of the high-ranking officials of the warden's office, he was fighting around Yutian Pass. But in reality, the Wei Wujiu, there was just a substitute. The Wei Wujiu, who was fighting around Yutian Pass, was wearing his 1,000 mountain cold snow armor. His figure looked abnormally tall and straight, carrying a suffocating pressure. However, the Wei Wujiu in Yangshan Commandery was only wearing the thin cotton robe of an ordinary advisor. He looked like a mediocre old advisor, his eyes dim. He was no different from those who were no longer valued by the generals and could only help with some military affairs in the advisor group. However, when this old man mentioned some crucial information or orders, his dim eyes would suddenly reveal a cold-blooded glint, which would make people shudder. She had him hide his identity and hide on the front lines of Yangshan Commandery, not because Zheng Xiu did not trust Feng Qilan's command, but because from the start, the focus of this battle was Yangshan Commandery. The mobilization of large amounts of grain and fodder, and Fu Su personally coming to the Yin Mountain front lines were just tactics to confuse the enemy. In order to cooperate with her shameless methods, Yangshan Commandery needed an iron-blooded and ruthless commander like her. Wei Wujiu might not be as good as Sima Qiu in terms of cultivation and strategy, but he was one of those extremely cold-blooded generals. He could carry out military orders without emotion. As long as he could ensure victory, he would not hesitate to sacrifice the lives of a few Chu people, or even tens of thousands of Qin people. The Qin army that had escorted the 70,000 Chu people quickly retreated. After abandoning the Chu people in the desolate plains, they did not go far. They were like hungry wolves that kept an eye on the weak and tired wolves. The 400,000 Qin army had already silently advanced. Like a giant beast opening its mouth, they were ready to swallow up the Chu army. When they were chased away by the Qin army, they had a clear destination. But when the Qin army suddenly retreated and was abandoned on the plains, these 70,000 Chu people lost their sense of direction. They started to panic, and then despair began to spread. Cries of pain could be heard everywhere. Some people were preparing to leave. At this time, most of the people who were preparing to leave were in their prime. Some were cultivators. They all had different goals. Some missed their families and were preparing to return to their homes in Yangshan Commandery. Some felt that they could no longer stay in Yangshan Commandery and were preparing to head for the Chu border. Among these people was a middle-aged man in a plain robe. The middle-aged man looked like a private tutor. His luggage was filled with books. When he finally made up his mind to leave, a woman suddenly walked up to him and asked softly, "You want to leave these people?" The middle-aged man was slightly startled. At this time, the surrounding crowd was already very chaotic. Those who could sense his intentions at the first moment must have been observing him. He could not help but carefully examine the woman who appeared in front of him. This was a very young woman. Her face appeared haggard, and her skin was slightly yellow. She wore ordinary and even tacky blue cloth robes, but she still appeared very pretty. He could not help but frown slightly. As far as he could remember, he had never seen this woman in the team these days. Even though there were more than 70,000 people in this troop, and he could not have seen all of them, but it was an instinct of cultivators to observe everyone along the way. Even if he accidentally glanced at a silhouette, he would not feel so unfamiliar. Even more importantly, this young woman was clearly observing him, but he had not sensed when this woman had come, or when she had come to him from the crowd. While he was slightly surprised, he still nodded and responded, "Yes." This woman had a unique presence, like a family member asking a question. She asked softly, "Where do you prepare to go? Back to Yangshan Commandery? Or to Chu?" The middle-aged man did not hide his thoughts and said, "Back to Yangshan Commandery." The woman said, "Is there someone you cannot let go of?" The middle-aged man hesitated slightly and said, "There is a woman I am close to. When she left, she said she would wait for me to return. I will go back and see if she is willing to return with me to Chu." This is a very large troop. The woman's tone became even stranger as she said, "Even if the number of Qin soldiers escorting these 70,000 soldiers were doubled, it would still be impossible for them to keep a strict watch on every single one of them during the long journey. Usually when they set up camp, travel through some forests, and when there is chaos with your cultivation, it is too easy to find a chance to leave. In reality, many cultivators found a chance to leave at the start. But you did not leave before, so why are you leaving now?" The middle-aged man was silent for a long time before he said softly, "Because it is useless." The woman looked at him. "What do you mean useless?" The middle-aged man raised his head and looked around. Looking at the many despairing faces, he took a deep breath and continued in a soft voice. "Previously, because of the Qin army's restraint, we were all gathered together. We only knew to move forward without any other thoughts. Even if some people could not hold on and died, they would die on the way forward. The remaining people were still forced to move forward. But now that the Qin army has left, there are no more restraints. These people will have all sorts of thoughts. The 70,000 people will scatter and split up. 70,000 people is not a small number. If these 70,000 people stay together, it will be easier for the Chu to rescue them. But if these people scatter, it is not just a matter of rescuing them. Even more importantly, they give people a different feeling. Even if I am a general, I will not be able to resist fighting for the lives of 70,000 people. But there are thousands of people here, thousands of people there. How can I fight?" Even the upright officials in the Chu capital think the same. This is a matter of quantity. The lives of 70,000 people is a major matter. But the lives of a few thousand scattered people cannot be gambled on the victory or defeat of some large armies. The woman's expression did not change much when she heard his words. Instead, she shook her head impatiently and said, "There is no need to make such a simple matter so complicated. Simply speaking, if these 70,000 people are separated, they will no longer give off the feeling of 70,000 people. It will be a few thousand here and there, 10,000 there. After they are separated, the numbers will not appear large. You will suspect that the Chu army will not do its best to save them. The result of this is that these people who are close to their limits will not be received no matter which direction they go. Most of them will die along the way. In the long run, if the army of our dynasty does not save them, and these people die, the Qin will make an issue out of their deaths. Even if it is their shameless methods, in the end, it will involve the morality and humanity of our dynasty." After saying this, the middle-aged man was silent for a moment, and then said slowly, "But the future has nothing to do with the present. I did not leave them before because I felt there was hope and I could do my best to help them. I am leaving now because I cannot bear it. I do not want to watch these people die miserably. This is just a matter of my state of mind. It may not matter if others leave, but if you leave, these 70,000 people will scatter even faster. Because you are Ji Baixing. You are a very famous bookseller in Ear City of Yangshan Commandery. Many people here know you. The most important thing is that you have used your Jinqi to save many dying people, especially many young children, during these days when you were in this team. So you may not have noticed, but in reality, your actions can affect most people here." The woman didn't argue with him. Instead, she used a tone that left no room for doubt, and even carried a hint of arrogance as she ordered, "You're quite knowledgeable. You should know that since ancient times, humans have always lived in groups. Even if we're all in a predicament, when more people gather together, there will always be a way. Even if we're just enduring, we'll be able to last a little longer. So what you need to do now is to make sure these 70,000 people do not scatter." The middle-aged man was filled with helplessness and sadness. He was powerless to speak. If he could do it, Would he need this woman to tell him this? If there is a clean water source, it can at least make people feel safe. There is a small lake 2 hours away from here. You can tell them that they have to get there before sunset. There is water, and they can try to catch fish. The woman did not care what he thought and continued to order. The man called Ji Xingbai was stunned and then grimaced. He said, "How many fish can they catch? The fish they catch are far from enough, and it will cause chaos. A drowning person will try to catch a straw. A person walking in the desert who is about to die, if you give him the hope of a water source, he can hold on for one more day. At this time, you only need an excuse to calm these people." The woman looked coldly at him and said, "Tell them, if they reach there, the Chu army will send some food and medicine at night." Ji Xingbai's face paled slightly, and his voice trembled. He said, "If their hope is destroyed, it will be even more unmanageable. If they find that there is no food and medicine delivered at night, these people will completely collapse. At that time, no one will be able to deal with this situation. Some food and medicine will be delivered at night," the woman said coldly and decisively. "It will be delivered. This is not an excuse." Ji Xingbai looked at her. He did not understand why her tone was so strong and confident. The woman did not explain anything. She only reached out and gently brushed his shoulder, as if she was just brushing away a stain. However, he instantly felt that this hand was incomparably heavy and tougher than any essence metal in the world. This was an extremely strange feeling, and at the same time, it made him instantly understand her identity. His breathing immediately stopped. After many breaths, he lowered his voice to the limit. In a voice that only he and the woman could hear, he said in a trembling voice, "Why are you here?" In reality, what he really wanted to say was, "How could you have sneaked into them so many days ago?" However, the words sneak in and sneak in were not enough to describe this woman. Chapter 583. The success of a stratagem does not depend on whether the stratagem is exquisite, but whether the stratagem has foresight and how thorough the person carrying out the stratagem can be. The woman did not look at Ji Xingbai, but at the Chu horizon. She said peacefully, "Tens of thousands of soldiers are escorting tens of thousands of people being driven away. As a cultivator, it is easy to find a chance to leave, and it is also easy to find a chance to enter these people. Even more importantly, no one would think that I would be among these people." Ji Xingbai took a deep breath. His heart beat violently, and a sickly flush appeared on his pale face. Indeed, no one would think that she would enter these people who were being driven away. The present emperor of Chu was Li Lingjun, but everyone knew that the strongest ruler of the Chu dynasty was the Empress Dowager, who had once been called Demon Consort Zhao. Now, this legendary ruler of the Chu dynasty was in front of him. This was definitely an extremely dangerous move. From a certain point of view, if she was killed, the result of this war was decided. Without her existence, the Chu dynasty would quickly fall apart and collapse in its own chaos. The cultivators of Chongling would pay attention to the movements of any powerful cultivator in the Chu dynasty's military, but most likely, no one could truly understand her, and no one would know of her movements. The fact that she was here was an impossible miracle. The woman, the former consort Zhao, the present Empress Dowager of Chu, looked at the horizon and sat down like the lonely and helpless women in this troop. Even her posture and expression were similar. She sat on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, her chin on her knees. Sometimes, her loneliness and sorrow were not faked. Even in the imperial palace of the Chu dynasty, she was very lonely. Every day, for the position she sat in, many bloody things would happen. Some people who hated her were dying, and some people loyal to her were dying. When the Qin army retreated, she learned of the death of her master in Chongling. She had thought that her master had died in the bloody storm years before Yuan Wu ascended the throne. Now, she knew that her master had been hiding in the imperial palace of Chongling all these years. But now her master was dead. Therefore, she was really sad now. Her master had died for the Chu people of Yangshan Commandery, so saving the lives of these 70,000 Chu people was equivalent to her master's last wish. It was as if it was the will of the heavens. If you want to fight me here, then I'll fight you here. She looked at the setting sun on the horizon and thought to the mistress of the Chongling imperial palace who might feel sorrow for someone. Dusk was approaching. Light would bring warmth to people. Darkness would make people panic and lose themselves. If they could not calm the emotions of these 70,000 Chu people, when night came, despair would spread. Fortunately, her observations over the past few days were correct. The vital essence of Ji Xingbai's cultivation method had the ability to temporarily free people from the torment of hunger and illness. Even though Ji Xingbai was just a Realm 6 cultivator, a cultivator like him, who was the pillar of support for many people in the troop, coming out was more effective than the encouragement of any other Realm 7 cultivator. When the last rays of the setting sun disappeared, he successfully led the group to the small lake that she had mentioned. Water splashed everywhere. Using the light of the fire, some strong men started to try to catch fish under the guidance of some experienced fishermen. This was a shallow lake, and most of the water only reached a person's chest. When the dry season came, it would probably dry up and become a grassland. The exhausted Ji Xingbai walked to the riverbank next to her and sat down silently. Having something to do could distract some people and bring hope. But after dawn tomorrow, whether these 70,000 people would listen to his suggestion would depend on whether the Chu army could deliver food and medicine tonight. But even with her promise, how could the Chu army do it? 70,000 people needed a lot of food. Even if they had made arrangements, how could a Chu army of a similar number hide from the eyes and ears of the Qin army and safely reach here? He could not help but have some suspicions, but he did not dare to question it. He did not even dare to look at and converse with that woman in case she appeared special. Consort Zhao, like other women and children, chose to sit on dry grass. Her gaze seemed to be on the people fishing in the shallow lake, but in reality, she was looking at the other side of the lake. Without any warning, Ji Xingbai's breathing suddenly became difficult. He sensed the ground suddenly trembling. This trembling came from the other side of the lake. At this time, other than cultivators like him, the Chu people gathered by the lake could not feel the trembling from the distant ground. But in just a few breaths, he was certain that this was the trembling from countless iron hooves hitting the ground at a high frequency. This was an army running, and at a speed far exceeding the usual limits of a cavalry army. The speed and frequency of countless iron hooves hitting the ground made him feel an aura of recklessness. He suddenly understood something. He stood up, his throat choked, and his eyes filled with hot tears. Extreme speed. Only by disregarding the safety of the steed and squeezing out the life force of the steed beyond the limit could one reach such speed. In the span of 10 breaths after he stood up, those able-bodied men who were fishing in the lake first sensed something strange. They saw the strange ripples on the surface of the water, and then heard the noises surging in the darkness from all directions. That was another army running, the iron hooves hitting the ground, but they could not match the speed of the previous army. That army did not care about anything, and like a gust of wind, they furiously charged towards the shallow lake. Ji Xingbai could not control his emotions. In the darkness, he turned his head and glanced at Consort Jingxiang on the shore behind him. He saw Consort Jingxiang was still sitting, and seemed to have merged with the ordinary women and children, but her face was indescribably solemn. Pew pew pew. The thunderous hooves were suddenly covered by the sound of the air being torn apart. Streams of fire appeared in the air, accompanied by even more small black shadows. Those were arrows, seal weapons, and could be the flying swords of cultivators. Countless loud roars rang out from the army that was madly charging towards the shallow lake like the wind. However, no one cared about the arrows or flying swords that reaped lives. The loud roars and shouts that connected together only caused the army to speed up again. The air was filled with the smell of blood and explosions. The trees and reeds on the shore were smashed apart by the black shadows. The cracking of branches and the cracking of bones mixed together, causing the Chu people on the other side of the lake to open their mouths, unable to breathe. They seemed to be petrified as they looked at this scene they had never seen before. The galloping horses charged out of the shore, smashing forward like meteors, pushing aside the trees and reeds, and then smashing hard into the lake. Countless rays of golden light fell from the sky, and even more rays of golden light pierced into their bodies as they charged down. The air on the other side of the lake was filled with metal wind, flowing fire, killing intent, and death. Batches of unimaginably fast cavalry did not care about everything that fell towards them. They charged forward, were killed, and charged into the lake. This scene did not just exist for a moment, but lasted for a long time. Soon, the water of the shallow lake was dyed red. Even in the darkness, one could see the deep color of blood. When all the shouts and roars finally disappeared, there were no longer any wild horses crashing into the lake with their riders. The metal flowing in the air finally disappeared as well. Only a few clearer sounds of horse hooves beating on the ground restlessly could be heard, patrolling the surroundings. At this time, many Chu people started to breathe again, and many people started to cry. Some people looked at the bodies of the horses and soldiers floating on the surface of the lake and started to understand what had happened. Their bodies started to tremble. Ji Xingbai's hands were also trembling. He was not a general, but even if he was, he might not have seen thousands of cavalry die in such a way in front of him. He looked at the other side of the lake. In the remaining light, he could see the figures of cavalry in black armor as they retreated. His hands were cold, but his body was hot. His blood seemed to have disappeared and started to burn inside his body. Have people salvaged the horses and the bodies? The bodies need to be taken care of quickly, otherwise the water will be polluted. But at this time, a cold voice reached his ears. He knew that this was Consort Zheng Xiang's voice. He also knew that this coldness was not due to cruelty and heartlessness, but targeted at their enemies. The food they brought with them is not enough to last long. We need to smoke the meat of these horses as soon as possible. Try to give up on the useless sorrow. If the 70,000 people exchange for the lives of these 4,000 people is not as good as these 4,000 people, then the Chu dynasty will really die. On the shore, her head was bowed as she said these words into Ji Xingbai's ears. Chapter 584. From the riding skills of these 4,000 cavalry, their charging speed, and their fearless presence, Ji Xingbai could conclude that this cavalry was one of the most elite cavalry armies of the Chu dynasty. If such a cavalry army was equipped normally, it would not be like today when they did not even wear light armor. Their combat power would far surpass tens of thousands of ordinary people. Even if they could not kill 70,000 ordinary people, it should not be a problem for them to completely crush them. But in terms of combat power, that old palace attendant who had committed suicide in the distant Chongling Imperial Palace, a grandmaster like her, was better than these 70,000 people. Some things could not be measured so simply. Ji Xingbai looked at the blood-dyed lake. He saw many young people who had come ashore go back into the water. Before he spoke, these young people started to pull out the corpses of the cavalry. More and more people went into the water, including many people who had been crying out of despair. The corpses of the soldiers were first dragged from the water near the other shore to the shore, and then the food and horses. This was a difficult journey across half of the lake, but no one seemed to feel tired tonight. Earlier, in order to make these people follow him to this lake, Ji Xingbai had used all the means at his disposal. But this night he did not need to say anything. He just stood there and watched this scene as if he was a statue. Many women and children were washing the corpses of the soldiers. Other than starting to process the food, medicine, and horses, many people silently put on the weapons the soldiers had carried, including the arrows and other sharp weapons that had been stabbed into their bodies. There were still many stifled cries and shouts in the group, but there was a great power that spread through the crowd. Ji Xingbai knew that after tonight, this kind of power would not just spread in the hearts of the people by the lake, but would spread to more places in the Chu realm. Tang Zhifeng, looking at the mountain at night, is a black mass. What can you see? Isn't it too boring? It is boring to run out at night and not see anything clearly from far away. It is not only boring to look at the mountain. You're right. Since I'm bored, I might as well accompany my brother to get some fresh air. On the Yin Mountain battlefield far from Yangshan Commandery, there were countless Chu tents in the darkness. On a hill among these tents, there were 7 figures standing silently. 6 of them did not speak, and only one person was talking to himself in boredom. The people around him were already used to his weird habit of talking to himself whenever he was excited. After living in seclusion with Tang Mei for many years, they knew each other like the back of their hands. Just like tonight, even the strategists and strategists of the Chu generals could not detect the intentions in Tang Mei's orders. Yet, the people standing around Tang Mei could understand what Tang Mei was going to do from the minute changes in his expression without needing to analyze the orders. Is it too risky? The cold Zhao sword furnace cultivator Zhao did not pay attention to Tang Zhifeng's words and turned to look at Tang Mei. When he asked this question, the aura around his body suddenly became a little hotter, and his skin even turned red. This meant that his emotions were different from usual. His emotions were turbulent under his calm expression. Everyone thinks that my style of leading the army is too conservative. Not just the enemy, but even our own people think so. Tang Mei smiled. He was very relaxed. Once the important decision was made, the burden in his heart was lifted. He smiled as he looked at the fire in the Qin camp that could be seen even in the darkness. He said, "But for marching and fighting, doing the opposite and making the other misjudge will bring about a chance of victory. You moved so many troops and fought so many battles. I felt that you would continue to be conservative like this. So you purposely fought like this for Sima Qiu to see." This time, Tang Zhifeng did not speak to himself and looked at Tang Mei. Tang Mei smiled faintly and said, "Even the people of the Bazin Kendo ground judge that I will fight slowly. If even they judge this, then Sima Qiu and Wei Wujiu will judge this as well. No one will know that I will start the final battle immediately. In reality, we do not have much choice. While our grain transport has not had a problem, only the Empress Dowager and I know that some of the unopened granaries were empty during the previous emperor's time. But even if we can win, the key to victory is Yangshan Commandery. There's a fatal flaw in your plan." A deep voice sounded. The speaker was the most silent of the people around Tang Mei. Usually, in Tang Mei's seclusion place, what he did was not beautiful. He just plowed and loosened the soil every day. But he was Jin Lufeng, one of the best strategists in the Chu military. Even if we win, even if we eat 300,000 Qin soldiers, the key is whether Yangshan Commandery can stop the Qin's counterattack. He looked down at the soil under his feet and said, emphasizing each word, "If we start the final battle, they will quickly wake up and find that you have gathered most of your forces here." On the other hand, the Qin army in Yangshan Prefecture was ready to launch a sneak attack. From Yangshan Commandery to Chu, they have lost dozens of cities and commanderies along the way. This battle cannot be fought. You are right. If I start the final battle in the Yin Mountain area, the Qin army in Yangshan Commandery will attack on all fronts. But Yangshan Commandery will definitely block the Qin army's counterattack. Tang Mei said slowly. He did not explain the reason. His words were domineering and slightly rude. Since Jin Lufeng said there was a flaw, then the difference in strength definitely existed. But those familiar with Tang Mei heard something unusual from his words. On the same night, deep in the Chu palace, Li Lingjun could not sleep. As a cultivator, he sweated every night. Because he was too nervous, his sweat often soaked his bedding. Because he hadn't slept well for a long time, his eye sockets were sunken deeper, even a little dark, and his face was abnormally pale. He knew that Consort Zhao was no longer in the palace. The real Consort Zhao had not been close to him for many days. He did not know where she had gone, but he had not revealed this information to anyone. He strictly guarded this secret. So he knew that Zheng Xiu's hidden pawn was not him. Then if it was not him, what was Zheng Xiu's strongest move? Because he could not think of it, he felt an inexplicable terror every day. On the same night, a man who rarely slept was walking on a mountain in the Yin Mountain battlefield, looking down at the camps of the Qin and Chu dynasties like an eagle. Chapter 585. The sun rose, The stars disappeared, and the night disappeared. A sentry of Qin army woke up early in the morning and crawled out of his tent. He took a bowl of vegetable soup with minced meat from a large pot placed on a stove not far away from the tent, broke a few pieces of dry bread, and had a hearty meal. When he climbed up the arrow tower and took over the sentry at the front to look at Tianqi City, his slightly satisfied gaze even showed a hint of sympathy. Tianqi City was one of the important border cities of the Chu dynasty on the Yin Mountain border. Yet when Sima Qiu and his 200,000 troops had slowly advanced, Lian Bo's elite cavalry had ambushed and cut off the connection between Tianqi City and the other Chu border cities. Now, Heavenly Awakening City had completely become a lone city surrounded by enemies. Many of the Qin soldiers even called this city Heavenly Forsaken City when they joked around. The Chu army was continuously retreating under pressure. This border city seemed to be fated to be abandoned. After being besieged for many days, the Chu army in this border city had suffered heavy casualties. Not just food, but even water was close to being cut off. The present military power of the Qin dynasty was completely different from the past. It was not just in the number of cultivators in the army, but also in the food. Ordinary Qin soldiers could clearly feel it, thinking about how they could eat so well for the first meal in the morning, while the Chu people in the devastated border city could only eat bark and grass. This Qin sentry unconsciously felt some sympathy. But even so, the Chu army in this abandoned border city was extremely tenacious. In the past few days, the Qin army, 3 times the size of this border city, had attacked more than a dozen times. Some powerful cultivators had even charged into the streets. But relying on some seal weapons, the Chu army inside, or rather the Chu people, still managed to defend this city. When the Qin sentry thought of this, the hint of sympathy in his eyes disappeared and turned into seriousness. But in the next moment, his expression suddenly froze and his eyes were filled with shock. Many strange reflections and smoke appeared on the distant horizon. Some of the golden reflections and smoke pillars were the Qin army's means of communication and should have come from the vanguard of the Qin army. More of the reflections came from armor and weapons, and the light from the seal weapons when they gathered primal energies of the universe. The black mass of cavalry began to fill his vision. At least 10,000 elite cavalrymen were marching towards the border city like a tidal wave. Using a seal weapon on the turret that could improve his vision, this Qin sentry saw that behind the tens of thousands of elite Chu cavalry, there were endless chariots. What shocked him even more was that many chariots were dragging rare large seal weapons behind them. They were like small mountains or like ships and palaces moving on the ground. The duty of a sentry like him was to be the first to discover the enemy and warn. But now, there was no need for him to warn because he was not the sentry at the front. Even more importantly, the golden light and smoke in the distance had clearly told all the Qin soldiers here that this was not a small Chu army, but a true army. The turrets at the border of Tianqi City were naturally much taller than the arrow turrets that the Qin army had built. The Chu soldiers on top of the turrets could see more clearly than the Qin soldiers. Looking at the army that seemed to cover the sky, and the 7 metal statues that were 60 feet tall, these Chu soldiers could not help but sink into shock. These tall metal statues were the image of celestial maidens. They were bronze and densely covered in sapphire blue lines. Each metal statue was surrounded by 9 chariots. There were multiple cultivators on each chariot, and among these cultivators, there was one person holding a short stick-shaped bronze seal weapon. This was the strongest seal weapon of the Chu army that the world knew was Flying Heaven. Each seal weapon needed 9 Realm 6 cultivators to activate, and each attack was far more powerful than an ordinary Realm 7. There were only 16 of these seal weapons, and they only existed in the main army of the Chu dynasty. So this was not a strategic counterattack, but a mad final battle of the army. Looking down from the sky, Tianqi City was a nail in the Qin army's defense line. The Qin army was mostly dressed in black robes and armor, like a black sea. On the other side, the Chu army was mostly dressed in blue armor and spread out like a river. In the plains far from Tianqi City where the pillars of light and smoke were shooting out, the vanguard of the Qin army was fighting with the vanguard of the Chu army. Arrows, flames from seal weapons, blood, limbs, and metal pieces flew through the air. The Qin army clearly had not been prepared and was retreating in front of the Chu army's mad attacks. In the sand table of the Qin army camp, Tianqi City was only a slightly larger flag. The usually empty camp was now filled with high-ranking generals and strategists of the Qin army, waiting for orders from Sima Qiu, who had a grim expression. Sima Qiu's gaze swept across many places, and he picked up many flags. In the end, his gaze stopped on Tianqi City. Before nightfall, I want our camp to move into the city. Then he, who had been silent for a long time, gave the order. A Qin general's breathing suddenly stopped. He had followed Sima Qiu for many years and knew that Sima Qiu's order meant that the 300,000 Chu soldiers would fight to the death while their rear army would advance and take down Tianqi City before nightfall. Why? While he could not disobey Sima Qiu's orders, he could not help but ask. The Chu army does not have enough food. If they charge like madmen, their food and seal weapons will not be able to keep up. Sima Qiu raised his head and looked coldly at him. He said, "But we did not expect Tang Mei to dare to do this. As long as the Chu army was unstoppable and won battles along the way, our food and seal weapons would become their supplies. From the present situation, we are on the verge of losing. Only by stopping the advance of the Chu army will the other armies be able to move in time. Otherwise, the main army will be defeated by their superior military power. Tianqi City is the best place to defend in the surrounding 100 miles. You should know what this Tianqi City is relying on to stop our army. If we can take down Tianqi City before nightfall, we can set up defenses in Tianqi City and stop the advance of the Chu army. Those armies along the way will naturally be destroyed by the Chu army. But compared to the only chance of victory, this sacrifice is worth it." Sima Qiu would only speak more when he was teaching Fu Su alone. Usually, when he was arranging battles and facing his subordinates, he rarely spoke. His abnormality caused all the Qin generals in the tent to understand that even Sima Qiu was extremely nervous. "I will go." A cultivator with shoulder-length hair, who looked like a strategist, spoke from a corner of the tent. He was also wearing a black robe, but the collar was very high, and a shadow covered his face. When he spoke, dark and cold energies suddenly surged from many dark corners of the tent. Many black flowers appeared out of nowhere. Some of the realm 7 cultivators in the tent who did not recognize him unconsciously narrowed their eyes. Sima Qiu did not look at him. He nodded and said, "Thank you, mister." Chapter 586. Who is this person? After this cultivator left the camp, an official of the warden's office could not help but ask in a low voice behind Sima Qiu. From Tang Mei's performance, everyone had greatly underestimated Tang Mei's abilities. Since Sima Qiu had set the location of the final battle at Tianqi City, then Tang Mei would likely have considered this possibility. There would be powerful cultivators coming to Tianqi City to help. What would decide who this city belonged to before nightfall was the battle between these powerful cultivators. Clearly, this cultivator who looked like a strategist cultivated the path of Een and ghosts. Cultivators who cultivated this method had a harder time reaching Realm 7 than ordinary cultivators, but once they succeeded, they were harder to deal with because of their strange methods. At the Deer Mountain Conference, that Mountain sect Yining who had posed the greatest threat to Yuanwu was the best example. But from a certain point of view, the path of Een and ghosts was an external path. Placing the key to victory on people the warden's office was unfamiliar with was not as reassuring as placing it on those grandmasters they knew. There are not many exiles on the Bazin Kendo ground. He is the one who has killed the most. Sima Qiu glanced at this official of the warden's office and said, "He did not come here because of me, ghost." The expressions of the surrounding officials suddenly changed. That official from the warden's office was incomparably pale. He could only say one word, but because he remembered who this person was, he was so shocked that he could not say a second word. What do these Chu people want to do? Wei Wujiu walked out of the tent and looked with a dark expression at the dust of the distant Chu territory. The Yin Mountain and Yangshan Commandery were very far apart. This meant that the two battlefields could not exchange information in a short time. When the majority of the Chu army in the Yin Mountain region was furiously advancing in the night and starting the final battle, the Yangshan Commandery had not received the corresponding military report. Yet if someone could see the entire situation, they would find that if the Chu army on the border of Yangshan Commandery did not change, then the final battle between the Qin and Chu armies in Yangshan Commandery would start earlier than in the Yin Mountain region. In fact, most of the Qin army in Yangshan Commandery was not far from the exiled Chu people. It was a vanguard from the left wing of the Qin army that killed the elite cavalry of the Chu army that night. After that, the main Chu army on the border had slowly advanced towards a small lake where the Chu people were. They seemed to be planning to retreat at any time and lead the Qin army deeper into the Chu lands. But a day or two ago, the Chu army had officially crossed the border and entered Yangshan Commandery, advancing multiple times faster than usual. When the sun rose this morning, Wei Wujiu had already issued the order for the entire army to advance at full speed to meet the enemy. If the Chu army did not retreat, the final battle of Yangshan Commandery would erupt by noon at the latest. The Qin army had been waiting in formation for many days. Even if they were to push forward to meet the enemy, it was like they were opening their huge mouths. Naturally, with the advantage in numbers, they would be able to swallow the enemy whole. So no matter how experienced Wei Wujiu was, he could not understand why the Chu army was doing this. In his view, the only possibility was that a great problem had occurred in the imperial court or the military of the Chu dynasty. Why is it like this? Wei Wujiu was not the only one who could not understand. Even Ji Xingbai could not understand. But unlike Wei Wujiu, he knew who to ask this question. There is no why. Consort Zhao looked at the growing dust and responded in a voice only he could hear. This is something that was agreed upon. What is agreed upon? How can we win? Ji Xingbai could not understand even more. Consort Zhao did not answer, like she did not hear his words. She looked silently at the sky of the Chu territory she was facing. The chaotic clouds gathered and were as heavy as a city. Then they were crushed into flowing fire by primal energies of the universe. The world started to shake. Regardless of whether she understood or not, hundreds of thousands of Chu soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Qin soldiers collided in front of her and the 70,000 Chu people. The Chu army formed into an arrow shape and stabbed into the Qin army formation. The Qin army wanted to surround the Chu army in a wild goose formation. Countless hooves stomped on the ground, and the dust started to dance like dragons. Countless swords and soldiers met, and the dust was filled with blood and limbs. Because of the chaotic primal energies of the universe, the plains formed countless whirlpools that swept up living horses and soldiers. Even the heavy chariots and seal weapons, as well as the arrows and flying swords flying in the air, were not spared. They were swept into the air and then thrown down. This was an unimaginable battle. Ordinary cultivators, under such chaotic energy turbulence, could not gather primal energies of the universe. They could only rely on their vital energy and the primal energies of the universe stored in their bodies to fight. Their power was greatly reduced compared to ordinary soldiers. The intertwined armies had become a true giant millstone, a true Azura field. The place where the two armies had first clashed was 30 miles from the small lake where the 70,000 Chu people were. Even so, the gusts of wind still brought down large amounts of metal fragments and pieces of flesh. There were even some light flying swords that had fallen into the lake. As time passed, the main battlefield grew closer to the small lake. Many lines of blood started to seep out of the clear lake water, where the small lake faced the battlefield. The soil of the battlefield was soaked in blood and sticky. When powerful forces landed on the ground, what splashed up was no longer dust, but waves of blood. The burning sun in the sky was entangled by the blood clouds and gradually dyed red, turning into a blood sun in the clouds. The cavalry on both sides had almost all disappeared. Even the chariots had lost their original use. It was hard to form a perfect formation in the muddy pools of blood. In the countless intersecting battle groups, there were no longer any elaborate arrangements. Only the instinctive killing of each other existed. Even though the light had dimmed, and the chaotic primal energies of the universe still swept through the battlefield, most of the dust had dissipated, and people could clearly see the scene of this enormous battle. Ji Xingbai's body had trembled with the ground at the start. Now his soul seemed to have left his body, and he seemed to have lost all feeling in his body. He was not a general, but from this perspective, he could faintly see the direction of this battle. At the start of the battle, the Chu army was still able to advance and push the Qin army back. This meant that the Chu army had the advantage at the start of the battle. Yet he saw that many of the giant seal weapons of the Chu army had fallen, and the Qin army at the flank was still able to advance. The Chu army's advantage was disappearing, and they seemed to be unable to stop the Qin army from surrounding them. If there was no miracle, then the outcome of this battle would not be one side losing tens of thousands of troops, but the Chu army being completely wiped out. Where was the miracle? He saw that the Qin army seemed to have some reserves that had not truly entered the battlefield. Some of the light cavalry hidden in the rear were clearly used for the final chase and harvest. Ji Xingbai could not help but turn a look at Consort Zhao, hoping to get an answer from her eyes. The moment he turned his head, he saw that her eyes seemed to be burning. The burning feeling came from the exceptionally bright flame in her eyes. She had been watching all this time, but now she started to walk. Chapter 587. At the start, no one noticed because she did not walk fast and dress normally. But when she walked out of the edge of the crowd by the lake, passed by the strong men and even cultivators, and left the crowd, she naturally attracted the gazes of the Chu people by the lake. These Chu people temporarily pulled their gazes away from the battle between gods and demons in the distance and looked at her. "Miss, come back!" Many women who were originally terrified to the extreme were the first to shout. However, this did not stop her from moving forward. She left the crowd by the lake and slowly walked forward with steady steps. Her figure grew lonelier. Under the bloody sunlight, her shadow grew longer, but gave off a heart-palpitating power. Many people started to realize what she was going to do. Their breathing and bodies grew heavier. Ji Xingbai was the only cultivator among these people who knew her true identity. Seeing her walk, he first thought of his family. He knew very well that if he followed her to the battlefield, he would never be able to see the family he longed for day and night. However, when he looked at her back, his feet started to move unconsciously. He became the second person to leave the edge of the crowd by the lake. Before this, Consort Zhao had been unknown among these Chu people. But he was different. Many times, he was seen as the person who saved these Chu people. When he walked out of the crowd, he walked faster towards the woman in front of him. He walked towards the battlefield without looking back. More and more people started to walk out of the crowd towards the battlefield. These people seemed to have invisible ropes on their bodies, leading more people out of the crowd and away from the relatively safe shore of the lake. "If we die, then we die." Someone let out a sigh before walking out of the crowd. This kind of voice was like a pebble that broke the silence. "If we die, then we die." More such voices sounded, and in the end, they became shouts. "Fight! Revenge! Revenge for our dead brothers and family!" Furious shouts erupted like a volcano. It wasn't just the robust men and cultivators. Even the unarmed women and children in the crowd who were still crying began to follow the people in front of them, and then they began to run. The 70,000 Chu people were dressed in all kinds of clothing, extremely haggard. But at this time, as they ran, the water in the shallow lake started to vibrate with their footsteps. Droplets of water left the surface and jumped up. Revenge? Revenge for what? A Qin reserve cavalry occupying a hill looked coldly at these Chu people. When these Chu people started to leave the lake and run, the general leading the cavalry sneered in disdain. With such a great battle erupting, the Qin army naturally considered the 70,000 Chu people here. especially when this reserve cavalry had participated in the encirclement of the Chu army that had sent grain that day. He had never doubted that these Chu people who saw the Chu army charging without regard for their own lives would be aroused from their bones and throw themselves into battle. But was this kind of blood useful? Of these 70,000 Chu people, only 1/5 were young. Most of them had not trained to kill. Even if there were a few cultivators, in his view, these people were not as strong as the thousands of elite Chu cavalry who were going to die. The 70,000 people moving like a tide was enough. But how long could their courage last? When their courage dissipated, even the most people were just sheep running on the grasslands. Kill her? This general's dark and cold gaze landed on the woman at the front. The first person to walk out would naturally be the first to pay the price of death. As his cold voice sounded, his left hand waved downwards, and the dozens of green seal weapons behind him gave off strange screeches. Like many poisonous snakes slithering through the seal scripts, the primal energies of the universe coming out of the seal weapon turned into dark green flames and then attached to the bolts that were fired by the seal weapon. The bolts shot into the sky and then fell down. A green rain of fire fell from the sky, covering the figure of the woman walking at the front. The muddy soil was scorched until it suddenly cracked. Then, it was burned red by the terrifying heat and turned into magma. The heat and the flames that emerged from the ground formed a real hell. Sticky bubbles emerged from the magma and burst forth with explosive sounds. The Chu people who were moving like a tide suddenly stopped. Looking at the sea of fire in front of them, many people's minds were blank. The Qin general who had given the order narrowed his eyes slightly, and a smug smile appeared on his face. However, in the next moment, his face suddenly froze. On the molten ground, among the burning flames, a figure was still steadily moving forward. When the heat quickly rose, almost all the Chu people immediately saw the figure of the woman. As if she was not affected at all, the woman walked through the magma and fire. Even her clothes were not affected at all. Many Chu people gaped, but did not understand their own emotions and could not make a sound. She was facing the cavalry army on the hill. The pupils of the leading Qin general and all the soldiers shrank. Unconsciously, a biting coldness surged out from the depths of their bodies. At this time, other than her steady advance, she made a new move. She slowly and patiently opened a bag she carried with her. There was a piece of clothing in the bag, and then she put on this clothing. This clothing was rich in color. Under the dim world covered by the bloody mist, it still flashed with dazzling and bright light, causing everyone who saw it to feel slightly dizzy. The most important thing was that the embroidery on the robe was a dancing phoenix. This was a real phoenix robe. Tied at the waist, the phoenix clothing was dazzling. At this moment, it was as if the most breathtaking beauty in the world had gathered on this woman's body along with the color of the clothes. This was the empress clothing of the Chu dynasty. Only the legendary demon consort of the Chu dynasty, the present Empress Dowager, could possess and wear such clothing. Only she could possess such a presence that could cause the world to change color and possess such beauty and majesty. She is the Empress Dowager, Holy Empress Dowager, she. In the next moment, these 70,000 Chu people went completely mad. In the various generations of history, the legendary holy emperors had led their armies into battle. Yet no holy emperor had ever put himself in danger like this. He was not in the middle of the army, but fearlessly walked at the front of the army alone. These 70,000 Chu people went completely mad. After a moment of pause, they started to run even more furiously. Many of the Chu soldiers in the distance started to notice the abnormality here. They started to hear the mad and hot-blooded shouts. Then they started to see the dazzling color. Then these Chu soldiers started to go mad. The battlefield was like a landslide. Mad shouts spread deep into the battle formation and exploded. Kill! Their pupils contracted to their limits and turned blood red. The Qin general on the hill gave a beast-like roar after he stopped breathing for a moment. Without waiting for the army behind him to move, he charged furiously. The red warhorse under him was wrapped in the primal energies of the universe that were furiously surging out of his body. It seemed to fly and burn like a red cloud. The entire army attacked. The cavalry behind him went mad as well, charging madly towards that gorgeous color. Both this Qin general and the cavalry behind him knew the cultivation of this legendary demon consort Zhao. Many of the nobles in the Chu capital who had tried to overthrow her rule had been suppressed by her hands. Yet they also knew that even if their cavalry could not kill this woman, if the army behind them could kill this woman, then this battle would end. With a mournful roar, the general at the front leaped high into the air with his warhorse. His vital energy started to burn. He even drew out the blood of his warhorse and gathered it into the seal scripts on his sword. The blood-red sword in his hand turned into a bloody cloud dozens of feet long that charged viciously towards Consort Zhao's chest. Yet in this moment, Consort Zhao disappeared from his sight. Then he saw her hand appear on his forehead. It is useless. Even if this is a surprise army, even if you can charge into the flank, it is not enough to change the result of this battle. Before his forehead shattered, he viciously spat out a mouthful of saliva and said to the woman, Chapter 588. The bloody cloud, dozens of feet long, and the headless corpse of the general fell behind Consort Zhao. Consort Zhao's fist was not tainted by any blood, like the purest white jade. She continued to walk forward steadily, towards the berserk cavalry that was swarming in front of her. 3 flying swords flew over with shrill howls, attacking her forehead, chest, and back. Following the 3 flying swords were 4 cultivators at the front. They jumped off their horses, the primal energies of the universe around them burning like flames. Their speed towards Consort Zhao was close to the 3 flying swords. The 3 flying swords and the 4 cultivators formed a powerful formation, sealing off all of Consort Zhao's paths of advance and retreat. Facing the attacks of the 3 flying swords and the 4 cultivators, Consort Zhao's steady steps did not seem to change, but the power erupting from her feet changed greatly, and her body started to accelerate. She didn't make any extra movements and simply charged forward. Her body hit the flying swords and then the 4 cultivators in front of her. There was a loud explosion. The swords broke, the bones shattered, and the flesh scattered. The 3 flying swords broke in half, and the bodies of the 4 cultivators turned into pieces of flesh that flew outwards. Consort Zhao's body passed through the flying bloody mist and started to walk at the same pace as before. Her expression did not change at all, as though all of this had nothing to do with her. Her skin was especially white and tender under the luster of the beautiful phoenix robe. It was as if it could be broken by the slightest breeze. No one would be able to associate her body with the world's hardest metal. It really is her. But this scene dispelled many of the cultivators on the battlefield who had been suspicious. Because all the knowledgeable cultivators in the world knew that Consort Zhao cultivated the celestial gold body. This method had once been thought of as a stupid and useless method that could only be beaten, but she had cultivated it to the extreme. Her body was the most terrifying weapon. What she cultivated was her physical body. The Chu people behind her seemed to wake up as they saw the 3 flying swords break when they hit her. They saw the 4 cultivators turned into flesh and blood by her simple and crude attacks. Saint Empress Dowager. The shouts that burst out at this moment were like a landslide. All of the Chu people who just now had stopped in shock shouted and started to run again. Their bodies and minds were in a state of frenzy that forgot fatigue and pain. Their feet stepped on the magma ground that had just formed. They did not seem to feel the burning soles and the smoke rising from the soles of their feet. The Chu army, who had fallen into a bitter battle, exploded with shouts. At this moment, the hundreds of thousands of Chu soldiers and the 70,000 Chu refugees seemed to have become one. Consort Zhao Xiang ran over the cavalry that was surging forward. Her fists punched out casually. As she walked, she was like an enormous hoe that plowed through the Qin cavalry. She easily cut through the army from the middle and created a blood wave that surged to the sides. Pew 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 pew. More and more sounds of flesh being pierced rang out. The Chu people behind her surged forward. Many Chu people fell at the same time, but this elite Qin cavalry disappeared, drowned in the surging tide of people. Consort Zhao Xiang looked up. Only now did her expression change, and a hint of pride appeared. Then she raised her head and shouted, "Wei Wujiu, old Wei, do you dare to fight me?" Her cultivation method was different from all other cultivators in the world. Her body was her life bond item. Her body was extremely strong. She shouted with all her power, and her voice was loud like thunder rolling through the world. It even felt like it suppressed all other sounds on the battlefield. Other than her loud voice, there was also her boldness. Her boldness now looked down on the world. She did not even care about the countless Qin soldiers in front of her. This woman is really a lunatic. At the very back of the Qin army, on a hill not too far away from her, a group of men and horses slowly appeared. At the very front was an old and lean old horse, and on the old horse was Wei Wujiu, who she called Old Devil Wei at this moment. After cursing with a sneer, Wei Wujiu lowered his head and said mockingly as if to himself, "This is a war between armies. Do you think this is a Jianghu feud in a game?" The shout was like thunder and spread into the distance. No one responded. Consort Zhao had an imperceptible, scornful smile at the corners of her mouth. Then she shouted again, "Wei Wujiu, old Wei, do you dare to fight me?" "Wei Wujiu, old Wei, do you dare to fight me?" "Wei Wujiu, old Wei, do you dare to fight me?" She shouted 3 times in a row, her voice echoing through the distant mountains. Her voice intertwined with each other, and it was as if there were countless people in the distant mountains stretching out their fingers and shouting towards this battlefield. As she shouted, she did not stop walking. Her figure moved further away from the 70,000 Chu people who were furiously following her. Even Ji Xingbai's figure fell far behind. No one dared to fight alone. The flank of the Qin army that she was facing inexplicably shook. A large army broke away from the flank, like a huge tentacle, and went to welcome this lonely woman between heaven and earth. Ji Xingbai's face paled. Many of the small things on the ground in front of him started to jump with the shaking of the ground. Even the small beads of blood in the ground were shaken into the air. Other than the weight hitting the ground, the shaking also came from the vibrations of energy. This was a large batch of seal chariots. The energy hidden inside the chariots had been completely activated. They sprayed out along the seal scripts and formed shadows of dragons and tigers around the chariots. These chariots seemed to be wrapped in dragons and tigers. They did not seem to be running on the ground, but flying over. The chariots of the Qin army were superior to the other dynasties to begin with. They were tools used to fight against powerful cultivators. At this time, the battle was so intense, but in this flank, there was still such a well-preserved army of chariots. This was frightening. However, what caused Ji Xingbai to shiver the most was that there were steel cables attached to the back of these war chariots. Behind the steel cables were several gigantic statues of fairies. These were clearly Chu weapons, the strongest seal weapons of the Chu army. The appearance and style of the fairies were slightly different from the strongest seal weapon of the Chu army, Flying Heaven, but they were similar. Even more importantly, at such a distance, even with his cultivation, he was certain that the primal energies of the universe coming off these fairies were the same as the energy of Flying Heaven. Chapter 589. The Qin swords were the foundation of the Qin dynasty, not just in the use of swords. Most of the sword-using sects in the world were gathered in Chongling and the art of forging swords. Other than the swords of the Zhao sword furnace that had been forged countless times by powerful cultivators, most of the famed swords in the world came from the Qin cultivation lands in the past century. Compared to the Qin swords, the seal weapons of the Chu dynasty were what the Chu dynasty relied on to compete with the other dynasties. The nature of a sword embryo was relatively simple, but the creation of a seal weapon was more complicated. carving the seal scripts into a formation to gather the chi of heaven and earth and make it circulate like the meridians in a cultivator's body. This not only required an extreme understanding of seal scripts, but also required superb forging and engraving techniques to fuse an astonishing number of lines into a square inch without the slightest deviation. Those unique and powerful seal weapons were very difficult to create. The final form of each one was the result of the hard work of generations of cultivators and craftsmen. Each one was as powerful as a powerful cultivator's full power attack. Most importantly, no matter if it was the materials used to make these practitioner weapons, the method of making them, the formation arrays, or the method of activating these practitioner weapons, they were all absolute secrets. They were secrets that only a few people in the imperial palace could come into contact with. Even if the other dynasties wanted to copy them, they would not be able to do so. Yet now, the strongest of the Chu weapons, Flying Heaven, had appeared in the Qin army and been copied by the Qin. Ji Xingbai was shocked and cold. In the army, many of the Chu generals and cultivators had burning anger in their eyes. Undoubtedly, someone had leaked the secrets of the highest level of Chu weapons to the Qin. If the secrets of the highest level of Chu weapons were leaked to the Qin, this meant that the other Chu weapons had no secrets to the Qin. On this battlefield, they were all fighting for the Chu dynasty. Countless of their brothers and friends had died on the battlefield, but inside the Chu dynasty, someone had betrayed all of them, betrayed the entire dynasty. Who was it that betrayed this country? Consort Zhao sensed the energy vibrations of these seal weapons before Ji Xingbai. She stopped. A series of terrifying explosions rang out. Hundreds of seal chariots flew up, truly flying. Under the full power of the cultivators on the other chariots behind these chariots far exceeded their usual limits and smashed towards her like hundreds of burning meteors. Sensing the landing of the chariots and the terrifying power rippling from the flying sky practitioner weapons, she seemed to realize something and frowned slightly. Between the heaven and earth, the primordial chi, which was already extremely chaotic, was torn apart by the 5 flames. These 5 colorful flames came from the 5 flying heavens. 5 streaks of light shot out from Fei Tian's hands and rapidly grew in size, turning into dazzling pillars of light. Compared to these 5 pillars of light, the hundreds of chariots that were hurtling towards Consort Zhao like burning meteors seemed insignificant. The yuan qi emitted from the hundreds of chariots connected into black chains, forming several layers of a dense net. And in the center of this net was Consort Zhao, which was also where the 5 pillars of light had fallen. Seal weapons could possess terrifying power, but the cultivator using the seal weapon may not be able to capture the true location of a powerful cultivator. Only such a large number of chariots, after countless practice, could trap a cultivator like Consort Zhao in one place. In this moment, many Chu cultivators paled, including many powerful Realm 7 cultivators. This was because even they could not imagine how they could survive such an attack. Frowning meant that they had not thought of it, and that it was difficult. But for Consort Zhao, this only meant that this matter was difficult and not impossible. She stood still and then punched. In the time when most people on the battlefield did not have time to sense, she punched 5 times. When she threw out her first punch, the ground under her feet suddenly caved in, as if it was hammered down by an invisible sledgehammer. In front of her fist, a blood-red glow appeared, as if a blood-red glow had appeared. This rainbow light came from the light coming from her fist. This was the energy and blood in her body flowing and pressing against each other, and the light coming out of her flesh and blood. In the next instant, the blood-red light turned into a ring-shaped shockwave that exploded outwards. Where her fist pointed, the compressed air turned into a terrifying power, an enormous sword essence. She usually did not use the sword, but she was a true disciple of the Bazin Kendo ground. At the most dangerous moment, her strongest move was still the sword. 5 bloody lights exploded in a row. In this moment, she punched 5 times. The 5 punches with enormous sword essence hit the bottom of the 5 chariots. The 5 chariots made of thick and heavy adamantine were blown away, and instantly began to disintegrate. Moreover, the speed of their flight far exceeded the speed of their fall, turning into 5 balls of light that were truly burning with deep blue flames. The ball of light continued to crash into the chariot above, and then collided with the 5 pillars of light descending from above. Compared to the 5 enormous pillars of light, this ball of light was like 5 thin needles stabbing into a falling metal rod. But in the next moment, the bases of the 5 flying apsaras gave off waves of hoarse and unpleasant sounds of friction, and then the 5 seal weapons fell backwards. The bases of the 5 pillars of light started to collapse, and the shattered light scattered like flowers. Patches of beautiful rainbow light exploded in the air, and the affected chariots were easily thrown away. Consort Zhao tiredly pulled back her fist. The ground she was standing on had already become a huge crater with a radius of several hundred feet. Around her, those powerful chariots were falling down like kites with their strings cut. The cultivators on the chariots, who were swept by the beautiful rainbow light, started to burn. Numerous cultivators silently flew up from behind the flying apsaras. Even though the primal energies of the universe were so chaotic that most cultivators could not absorb primal energies of the universe normally, the moment they flew up, there was still the sound of mountains moving in the sky, and terrifying amounts of primal energies of the universe were gathering towards this part of the world. Consort Zhao was very tired. It was impossible for her to throw out a punch like she did just now. It was impossible for her to withstand the attacks of several grandmasters like this. But at this time, she sneered and turned her head to look at the wasteland to her side. In that wasteland, many figures appeared, slowly gathering into an army. This was an army that was extremely exhausted, without any armor on their bodies. Chapter 590. This army seemed to have traveled for far too long. The soles of many of their shoes had been worn through, and there were even scabs sticking to the broken soles. It was an extremely miserable sight, but for some reason, the moment this army appeared, it attracted the gazes of countless people on the battlefield, making them inexplicably palpitate. A cold smile appeared at the corners of Consort Zhao's mouth. She simply jumped up and jumped backwards. Just like her previous attack, her every move was simple and straightforward. 2 terrifying forces burst forth from the soles of her feet. The ground that had already formed a huge crater shook violently once again. Her figure simply disappeared from the center of the crater and appeared far behind. Then, she disappeared again and appeared even further behind. After doing this 3 times, her figure appeared behind the 70,000 Chu people. The 70,000 Chu people were like her barrier. Then she sat down like a spectator, without any of the grace of a grandmaster or empress dowager. Just like when she had casually sat down by the lake, she was wearing a glowing phoenix robe. Numerous grandmasters of the Qin army had moved over a mountain of primal energies of the universe, but they had not expected her to take such a stance. She was clearly fleeing without fighting, but her simple and direct stance caused everyone to feel that this was unobjectionable and even natural. Not only did these evolved Jing masters feel the discomfort of having punched empty air, but they also felt a sense of defeat, as if they had been defeated before they had even exchanged blows with him. Kill! All of a sudden, an extremely heavy shout rang out between the heavens and the earth, causing the several grandmasters to hold their breaths again. This shout came from the army that had suddenly appeared. The voice came from every person in the army. Yet because they were so uniform, they spoke almost at the same time, and the shout seemed to come from one person. Along with this shout, everyone in this army took down the weapons on their backs. Then, they made a uniform movement and unwrapped the cloth wrapped around their weapons. There was a blinding golden light under the cloth. When everyone in the army took off the cloth wrapped around their weapons at the same time, the golden light connected together like countless small suns connected together to form an enormous and blinding sun that rose on the battlefield. No one in this army was wearing armor, but right now, as they bathed in the golden light, their bodies were covered in a layer of golden armor. In addition, Every single person in this army had the same aura, an extremely tenacious and powerful will. At this moment, this army appeared indescribably solemn and glorious. All the grandmasters in the Qin army had their faces changed, and their eyes were filled with shock. This kind of emotion quickly spread through the Qin army. At the same time, waves of cheers and shouts exploded in the Chu army formation like an avalanche. How is this possible? At the back of the Qin army, Wei Wujiu, who had left the battlefield, was dazed for a moment and gave a low shout. When this kind of golden light shone on the battlefield like the sun, there was no doubt about the identity of this army. Xiang Yan's Gold Dagger Army had been the strongest army of the Chu dynasty. Even if their individual power was not as strong as Bai Qi's god-killing army, they possessed unimaginable resolve and unique tactics. They were invincible on the other side of the Chu dynasty. But that was on the other side. Even if they threw away all their golden armor and dressed lightly, how could they be so fast? In the estimation of any high-ranking military officer of the Qin army, it would take at least 10 days for this army to arrive at the Yin Mountain region or Yangshan County. This was the most extreme estimate, exceeding the most extreme estimate by a dozen days. What kind of concept was this? After a moment of daze, Wei Wujiu suddenly felt pain. His body uncontrollably trembled. Only now did he see the evil intentions of his opponent, Consort Zhao Xiang. Of course, Consort Zhao Xiang did not want to lead the 70,000 Chu people to attack the flank of the Qin army alone. She just wanted the Qin army on the flank to be attracted by her and separated. If not for the Gold Dagger army, she would not even be able to survive the attack of the Qin army. Yet at this time, the Qin army's flank formation was in chaos because of her. Even the seal weapon formation was unstable. This was the best time for the Gold Dagger army to attack. If the Gold Dagger army attacked the flank, the Chu army inside would not be idiots. Under a pincer attack, the Qin army's flank would quickly be defeated and eaten. Adding on that these 70,000 Chu people were also people. With their momentum, it would not be the Qin army that would completely surround the Chu army, but the Chu army would open their mouths and eat the Qin army. Capture the leader to capture the bandits. Take Xiang Yan's head. The numerous Qin grandmasters on the flank felt their hearts beat rapidly amidst the waves of cheers and shouts of the Chu army. These grandmasters guarding the flank were experienced and could see the situation immediately. They knew that it was hard to say how strong the Gold Dagger army that had traveled a long way was, but this legendary army was a fatal boost to the confidence and presence of the Chu army. When hundreds of thousands of soldiers were in a frenzied state, even if it was a chaotic battle, there was likely no army of the same number that could match them. These Qin grandmasters had the same thought. Only by quickly killing the commander of the Gold Dagger army, Xiang Yan, could they change the result of this battle. With several crackling sounds, these grandmasters pushed their vital essence to the extreme. They turned into several streaks of light that shot towards the Gold Dagger army. Like several large swords, they instantly cut through the void and slashed towards the Gold Dagger army. Behind them, there were loud, ripping sounds. At least dozens of cultivators followed behind the grandmasters like flying swords towards the Gold Dagger army. The Qin people were valiant. The presence of these dozens of cultivators did not lose to the Gold Dagger army. Especially at this moment, waves of shouts sounded from the Qin army. So what if it is the Gold Dagger army? Which of our Qin troops is not as good as the Gold Dagger army? Coming all the way here is just a bluff. Following these shouts, large amounts of seal weapons were activated. Waves of rainbow light fell towards the Chu army like a storm. Behead! Looking at the sword lights of the Qin grandmasters, and hearing the shouts from the Qin army, Consort Zhao, who was sitting casually on the ground, smiled mockingly and said softly, "Even I cannot take Xiang Yan's head in front of the entire Gold Dagger army. Much less you? Who will behead who?" Chapter 591. Sword energies flashed and cut through the wind. Multiple Qin grandmasters pushed their vital energy to their limits. They moved vast amounts of primal energies of the universe from the surroundings and gathered them into their sword essences. The chaotic energy turbulence in front of them was cut apart, almost forming a true vacuum. Even the dozens of cultivators following behind them lost their resistance. Their sword lights grew faster. From a distance, it looked like multiple meteor-like large swords were dragging dozens of small meteor-like swords. They danced wildly in the hell field filled with demonic flames and blood energy. It was a spectacular sight. General, thank you for your teachings these years. I will not be able to serve you in the future. A gold dagger army general following next to Xiang Yin said respectfully to him in the incoming wind. His hair was cut by the blade-like wind, and blood even appeared on his face. All the Chu people will remember this battle. Xiang Yin nodded and said, "Kill!" Cold shouts rang out around him once again. The dozens of gold dagger army soldiers, including the general, suddenly sped up, turning into dozens of golden lights, leaving the formation and heading towards the Qin grandmasters at the front. A dragon roar suddenly sounded in the sky. When this dragon roar sounded in the air, the wide sleeves of a blue-robed swordsman among the numerous Qin grandmasters gave off ear-piercing sounds like gold chains breaking. It was like an enormous beast had broken free of its shackles and was released. This indigo-robed swordsman's face was as white as jade. He looked calmly at Xiang Yin, who was walking on the wind. He was the fastest among the Qin grandmasters, and happened to meet the gold dagger army general who had spoken to Xiang Yin. Yet, these dozens of golden lights did not appear in his sight. An extremely dry life-bond presence erupted with the dragon roar in the sky and the ear-piercing ripping sounds coming from his sleeves. A yellow life-bond sword appeared in his hand. The color was like a random patch of color on a weathered wall in the desert. His life-bond sword seemed to casually swing forward, but the sword light flowing off the sword produced many profound changes. A piece of the sky above seemed to be missing and was suddenly filled into his life-bond sword. An extremely dry presence moved forward. In the path of his sword, the ground soaked in blood lost its moisture, dried and cracked, and then turned into crimson red sand. This was a powerful and unique sword essence. So when the sword essence appeared, many cultivators on the battlefield were certain that this came from a grandmaster of Heart Yang sect. In the history of Chongling, Heart Yang sect had once been the mortal enemy of the Tianyi Pavilion. Like the present Heart Chamber sect of Chongling, they had been one of the strongest cultivation places. Yi Sealing primarily cultivated the sword arts of the Tianyi Pavilion, the strongest of which was One Heaven Water. Heart Yang sect's Fire Generates Earth sword manual was the opposite of the Tianyi Pavilion, and had a strong restraining effect on the Tianyi Pavilion's sword manual. In the view of the outside world, Heart Yang sect had declined in Chongling long ago. They had not made any noise in the last decade, and no grandmaster above Realm 7 existed. Yet when this indigo-robed grandmaster's most pure Fire Generates Earth sword essence appeared, all the cultivators on the battlefield who had thought so knew they were wrong. A once powerful sect did not produce a grandmaster for many years without losing their sword manual. The key was opportunity, the talent and comprehension of the sect's disciples, and some people could not have a breakthrough. A sect like this would either not produce a Realm 7 grandmaster, or if a Realm 7 grandmaster appeared, they would leave a mark in the history of cultivators. Facing these gold dagger army soldiers who had not reached Realm 7, this Heart Yang sect grandmaster naturally had his own pride, so he only attacked Xiang Yin. As to these cultivators who came face to face with his sword path, in his view, they would naturally die in his sword path, even if they were just affected. The ground cracked and turned to dust. The skin of the gold dagger army general in front of his life-bond sword quickly dehydrated and split open. Before the blood seeped out, the skin turned to dry dark red powder that flew out with the wind. Yet this gold dagger army general's hands were unusually steady. His flashing golden dagger hit the life-bond sword of this Heart Yang sect grandmaster with a muffled sound. The golden dagger axes that the majority of the gold dagger axe army used were strange weapons to the Qin people. The dagger axes were like swords, but they had curved edges. With a swing and a pull, they could catch the enemy's weapon. This gold dagger army general was like this. When his dagger hit the life-bond sword of this Heart Yang sect grandmaster, it immediately twisted and pulled down the blade. At this time, this Heart Yang sect grandmaster's sword heart was clear. He was unmoved, and his sword essence continued to move forward. Vast power swept out along the golden dagger. The flesh of this gold dagger army general's hands turned to dust as though they were burning. Then this power spread to his arms and rippled through his entire body. At this moment, his arms and his entire body seemed to have turned into sand and scattered away. But at this time, this Heart Yang sect grandmaster's mind suddenly became restless. The 4 soldiers behind the gold dagger army general stabbed their daggers into his body at the same time. Vital energy and energy of the same nature flowed through the meridians of the gold dagger army general, like water breaking through a dam and into the dagger on his life-bond sword. The 5 powers merged into one and charged towards his life-bond sword. His life-bond sword hummed and paused for a moment. It was just a momentary pause. His body seemed to have collided with a wall in the midst of his mad dash. With a boom, he was violently shaken. The gold dagger army general and the 4 soldiers behind him were torn apart by the power. But in this moment, he saw a golden light that could match him fly out from behind the 5 gold dagger army soldiers and land on his body. However, at this moment his sword was stopped and he was at his weakest. He could sense what was going to happen next, and his heart was filled with sorrow. Phew! He heard the sound of flesh separating from his neck. In the next moment, he saw Xiang Yin pass by him with a solemn expression. The grandmaster of the Yang Heart sect felt his body become lighter, but his head had already flown up. The moment he could still feel, an unimaginable scene appeared in his perception. Around him, there were 3 heads flying up like him. Xiang Yan's golden dagger was like a rainbow that swept through this area of hundreds of feet. His attack had not just cut off his head, but the heads of the 3 grandmasters as well. The 3 grandmasters had encountered the same thing as him, and had been stopped for a moment by several gold dagger army soldiers. What kind of tactic was this? What kind of army was this? These few people in a team could temporarily trap the sword of a grandmaster? Until his consciousness disappeared, he only felt shock and puzzlement. Yet time seemed to freeze on the entire battlefield. No one was able to recall what had happened in the blink of an eye. An even more shocking scene had already filled their eyes and burned their hearts. Xiang Yan's body stopped. The long golden dagger in his hand was leveled in the air and caught the 4 falling heads. The heads of the 4 Qin grandmasters were placed firmly on the golden dagger in his hand and stretched forward. Chapter 592. This is not fair. A sword master, who was following the 4 grandmasters, let out a furious roar. His flying sword drew a white line in the air, pointing directly at Xiang Yan's chest. There was no finesse to this attack. It did not even represent his cultivation, just his mood and attitude at this time. Beheading 4 realm, 7 grandmasters with one blow. This appeared very impressive, but it was at the cost of sacrificing multiple small groups of cultivators. In his view, even Xiang Yan's display of power right now was an opportunistic and despicable act. Yet the moment he shouted angrily, the gold dagger axe army, surging in front of him, gave off a wave of metallic clangs. In the next moment, over 1,000 strands of golden wind shot out of the gold dagger axe army's formation as if they had ripped through space. He could sense that they had even formed a huge golden wall that fell down. The terrifying metal clanging came from the golden daggers in the hands of the gold dagger army. Dagger tips shot out of the daggers like flying swords. Under the dual effects of vital energy and the mechanisms inside, they flew faster than ordinary flying swords. These dagger tips were separated from the golden daggers, but the tails were connected to thin silver chains. The silver chains carried a cold presence. This was the silver snow iron produced in the Xinjiang Commandery on the southern border of Chu. Pew 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 pew. No one below Realm 7 could stop the thousands of golden lights that came like flying swords. The sound of flesh being pierced sounded. The dozens of cultivators following behind the 4 grandmasters were all pierced by the golden daggers. Golden light came out of their bodies with a torrent of blood. After the golden spears pierced through their bodies, they were quickly pulled back by the cold iron chains, once again creating a mist of blood in front of them. There is only victory and defeat on the battlefield. There is no fairness. An ordinary gold dagger army soldier passed by this Qin cultivator who was covered in dozens of wounds. He said coldly as this cultivator fell forward. In a flash, the 4 Realm 7 grandmasters were beheaded and dozens of cultivators were killed. There was a loud boom. The Chu army seemed to wake up from a dream and gave unprecedented cheers and shouts. Ever since Consort Zhao had acted and this gold dagger army had arrived, the Chu army had been filled with earth-shattering cheers and shouts. This time, it was louder than any of the previous times. The entire space was shaken by the sound waves. Many of the Qin generals had gloomy expressions. They could see that the gold dagger army was close to their limits, and they were fighting through sheer willpower. But this was how it was on the battlefield. What decided victory was often momentum and willpower, and not actual combat power. The Chu army had gone completely crazy. The true deciding factor was not Consort Zhao and the Gold Dagger army, but the main Chu army that had gone completely mad. Wei Wujiu looked silently in the direction of Consort Zhao and the Gold Dagger army. Next, the flank of the Qin army would definitely be broken. Yet he had not given the order yet. When the 4 grandmasters died, their heads were first placed on the golden dagger axe by Xiang Yin, and then scattered on the ground like ordinary sundries. A strange glow appeared in his hazy eyes. It was like a piece of wood that had been silently buried in the mud had started to burn. He thought for a long time and started to walk in the direction of the 70,000 Chu people. More accurately, he was walking in the direction of Consort Zhao. At this time, the army following him naturally knew his identity. When he started to move, his personal army was shocked. A cultivator who was dressed like him as a military advisor quickly followed him. Marquis, do not be impulsive. Consort Zhao herself and Xiang Yan's actions are bait. They know that you are the commander, and that you have never been defeated in such a situation. So they're deliberately doing this. This cultivator could easily keep up with his steps. This meant that his cultivation was about the same as his. Being able to say such words at this time meant that this cultivator was one of Wei Wujiu's closest confidants. Looking at Wei Wujiu, who did not immediately respond, this cultivator added, "They are deliberately humiliating you to lure you over. You are a marquis and the commander of the army. You are responsible for the lives of countless people. You cannot be treated as an ordinary cultivator." "You are right." Wei Wujiu suddenly laughed and said, "But you speak of defeat. Since victory has not been decided, how can there be defeat? Since she is there, I naturally have to try to kill her." After a pause, he glanced at the shocked cultivator next to him and said, "The other is full of vigor right now, and the flank will be broken. But before the flank is broken and the Chu army meets up with her, there is still a chance to kill her. If we do not even dare to try, how can the Wei Marquisate establishment have a place in Chongling in the future? A general success is built on the bones of 10,000. Wei Wujiu looked at where the 4 grandmasters had died and said slowly and coldly, "What built up my military achievements and the Wei Marquisate establishment are not just the heads of the enemy, but also the heads of my brothers. Even old Wei can't sit still? That's right, almost all of our old men are dead." In the hell-like battlefield, an old man sighed, but then he laughed proudly. "Marquis." The generals next to him immediately understood what he wanted to do and spoke in unison. "A bag of old bones. It is the same wherever they die. It is best if they can die here and ensure the safety of the Fong Marquisate establishment." This old man straightened and started to walk. His figure grew faster until he could not be seen. When a cultivator's killing intent reached a certain level, it would cause changes in the flow of primal energies of the universe, and even change the shape of the clouds in the sky. It was easier for other powerful cultivators to sense it. Before these two of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty officially appeared in her sight, Consort Zhao had sensed them. She frowned and then smiled. She said softly to herself, "Then let's see if you can kill me." There was a loud boom. The cultivator next to Wei Wujiu could not control his killing intent and emotions. His presence resonated with the primal energies of the universe in the distance. Amidst the thunder, the primal energies of the universe naturally gathered. A purple bolt of lightning appeared in the sky and did not dissipate. This huge sound was like a fuse, causing a series of explosions. The sky rumbled continuously, and it was as if a huge mountain was sliding down, constantly exploding with even more astonishing flames. Each marquisate establishment naturally had terrifying power. When the marquises went into battle, their experts naturally all came out. In this moment, there were 13 mountains of primal energies of the universe moving in the sky. Chapter 593. For the cultivators of the Chu dynasty army, the flank was still an impenetrable barrier. The 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty were able to become marquises not just because of military service, but because of their own cultivation. Even excluding Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate, Chongling still had some cultivators who were stronger than some of the 13 marquises. Among the 13 marquises, there were strong and weak. The outside world had different opinions of them. Wei Wujiu's cultivation was considered strong among the 13 marquises, but he was not at the top. The most terrifying thing about him was that he was cunning and astute, and he had accumulated a lot of experience. He had many level 7 grandmasters following him. Many of these realm 7 grandmasters were brothers who had gone through life and death with him, but some he had slowly raised over the years. They could be thought of as his disciples or even his nephews. The more powerful cultivators followed him, the fewer chances he would have to act. Therefore, in many battles in the past, it was very rare to see him take the lead and make a move himself. At this time, when he moved, he showed a strong resolve to kill Consort Zhao. This was like a powerful invitation. 13 Realm 7 cultivators were not much compared to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. But the two armies had been fighting for a long time. Many of the cultivators had died or were seriously wounded, and they restrained each other. At this time, the Qin army still had 13 Realm 7s. This was enough to show how strong the Qin dynasty had been in these years. Wei Wujiu moved silently, but a hint of satisfaction appeared in his eyes. These 13 cultivators even had the possibility of assassinating an expert like the Yuanwu Emperor. Consort Zhao was an anomaly among Realm 7s, but how could she match these cultivators? Xiang Yin looked up slightly. His gold dagger army was still charging towards the Qin flank, but he started to leave this army and move towards Consort Zhao. In a sense, his situation was similar to Wei Wujiu's. The world knew that the gold dagger army he commanded was the strongest army of the Chu dynasty. But this army was always stationed at the borders of the Chu dynasty and fought against some uncivilized tribes. The world only knew that his cultivation must be very strong, but they could not see how strong he was from his previous attack that killed 4 heads. Wei Wujiu's invitation received many responses, and he was slightly satisfied. Fang Qilin's considerations had nothing to do with life and death. The other grandmasters who had walked out had their own thoughts. A black-clothed swordsman sensed the other 12 powerful auras and looked to his left in shock. In his perception, there was a part of the sky that had turned dark green, as if countless aquatic plants were dancing wildly. That kind of yuan qi was very unique. It belonged to the unique cultivation method of the former Great Wei dynasty. Only Lian Ho and Lian Bo could cultivate this cultivation method to such a degree. Lian Bo was also here? Then the one leading the 50,000 tiger army in the Yin Mountain was just his subordinate? This swordsman took a deep breath. He sensed Zhang Guangdao's presence and was sure that the one leading the Yin Mountain should be Lian Bo's subordinate, Li Daozhou, whose cultivation was the closest to Lian Bo's. There were 3 marquises here. From a certain point of view, the number of powerful cultivators the Qin army had stationed here surpassed the Yin Mountain. So why would Consort Zhao use herself as a bargaining chip here, and not the Yin Mountain? Was it really just for these 70,000 Shu people? The truly high-level people should pay attention to the overall situation. This black-clothed swordsman was at the bottom of the 13 Qin grandmasters who were attacking Consort Zhao in both status and cultivation. But he was the only one who thought of this immediately. These 13 Qin grandmasters were all heading towards Consort Zhao. Even the commander of the Gold Dagger Army, Xiang Yin, left the army and flew towards Consort Zhao. The intentions of these Qin grandmasters could be said to be extremely clear. Do not go. Yet when some of the cultivators at the front of the 70,000 Shu people wanted to charge towards the 13 Qin grandmasters, Ji Xingbai shouted at them. Why? Numerous cultivators stopped in their steps and looked at the pale Ji Xingbai. I understand her better than you. She does not want us to go over. Ji Xingbai looked at these cultivators and said. It was just a simple sentence, but Ji Xingbai seemed to have exhausted all the energy in her body. Her clothes were drenched in sweat. In reality, he had only interacted with Consort Zhao for a short time. But from the moment he learned of her identity to now, he could sense that Consort Zhao's confidence and pride had not changed. At this time, he started to believe that Consort Zhao had chosen him out of the 70,000 people not because he had some prestige among these people, but because of other reasons. When a main general chose his lieutenants, he did not choose those who were second only to him in terms of combat power and strategy, but to choose those who understood him and his intentions the best. If she had not misjudged him, and he had not misjudged, then Consort Zhao had a way to resolve this situation and did not need them to fearlessly sacrifice their lives. Including him, these 70,000 Shu people did not have enough cultivators to pose a threat to the 13 Qin grandmasters. So if they had to sacrifice their lives, they had to wait for the right time. Just the 2 of us? Xiang Yin and Consort Zhao were relatively close. He was the first to reach in front of Consort Zhao. He knelt on one knee and bowed. In the Chu dynasty, this was the highest form of etiquette, especially on the battlefield. This kind of etiquette did not just represent ordinary respect, but also status. If more people come, these Qin people may discover my tracks ahead of time. Also, there are not many people worthy of my absolute trust. When Xiang Yin arrived, Consort Zhao had stood up. She nodded in return, explained, and then said softly, "The 2 of us are enough." Xiang Yin raised an eyebrow slightly. Of course he felt it was not enough. There was no Realm 7 Grandmaster in the world who could face 13 opponents of the same level, except Wang Jingming back then. He knew his limits, but since she said it was enough, then he believed she had her reasons. Consort Zhao straightened and then raised her head. Among the 13 auras that represented powerful grandmasters, one of them was the first to descend like a rolling avalanche. Snowy mountain sword form, Wei Wujiu's White Mountain. Consort Zhao looked at the figure that had come first with this presence and seemed to be flying in the air. She shouted the person's identity and then said proudly and disdainfully, "The first to test the sword is still one of Old Wei's people." This time, Old Wei is really going all out. But even with so many people coming, he is still so cautious. He has not changed his nature. Her words were clear, and her voice spread through the surroundings. She did not seem to be channeling her vital energy at this time. But before she finished speaking, the sword essence in the air formed. With a boom, countless dazzling white sword lights appeared in the sky like a collapsing snow mountain had appeared out of thin air. This sword move was purely the way of hard and fierce crushing. It was the most classic sword move of the Qin people. But facing this sword move that no one could dodge and could only be defeated, Consort Zhao only crushed a thin object in her hand. With a crisp crack, it was like crushing a thin teacup. This sound was covered by her voice. Yet as multiple faint blue streams of light flowed out of her fingers, A ball of energy vibrations more violent than this sword essence came out of her hand. A blue shadow appeared in front of the avalanche of dazzling white sword light like the shadow of a mountain gate. But when the blue shadow flashed, the Qin Grandmaster behind the sword light gave a shrill scream. He flew backwards like a hawk, and a bloody mist exploded in front of his chest. Consort Zhao smiled, her smile extremely enchanting. Do not forget that Chu weapons are the best in the world, and I am the Empress Dowager of the Chu dynasty. Who can have better Chu weapons than me? Chapter 594. Consort Zhao Xiang had been called Demon Consort Zhao by many people in the Chu dynasty. Her smile was too enchanting. At this time, her smile was enough to make the most beautiful flowers in the world lose color. But these Qin grandmasters felt a chill. She was the Empress Dowager, but in reality, she was the ruler of the Chu dynasty. All the Chu weapons of the Chu dynasty belonged to her. Just now, she used a seal weapon to seriously wound a Qin grandmaster. How many more such terrifying Chu weapons did she have? The indigo mountain gate shadow had disappeared in front of her, but there were still many green leaf-like energies flying in the air, ripping through the air and giving off sounds of tearing. This sharp and powerful presence even reached Wei Wujiu hundreds of feet away. He looked down slightly at the multiple tears on his robes, and then said, "This is the door-sealing token, one of the 5 legendary weapons of the Chu dynasty. Also, some of those weapons are not meant to be used against enemies. Do not tell me you have many of these Chu weapons. What is known to outsiders is not a true killing weapon." Consort Zhao looked at Wei Wujiu and said disdainfully, "You speak so well. Why don't you come up and see what else I have?" Wei Wujiu sneered. "Since the door-sealing token is in your hands, then a Chu weapon like the Sumera formation naturally is also here." Consort Zhao sighed and said with regret, "Old ghost is old ghost. You think clearly. But you can gamble. Maybe the Sumera formation is not here. Or maybe the Sumera formation does not have the power of the legends. So you have such an idea." Hearing the conversation between Consort Zhao Xiang and Wei Wujiu, the Qin grandmasters in the surroundings felt cold again and even broke out in a cold sweat on their backs. According to the limited records of cultivators, the Chu dynasty's Sumera formation was a kind of self-destructive seal weapon. The special characteristic of this kind of seal weapon was that the stronger the attack, the stronger the explosion. From a certain point of view, Consort Zhao, a cultivator with a strong physical body, was a perfect match for this kind of seal weapon. The more grandmasters attacked together, the greater the power she could generate when activating this seal weapon. Her body might be able to withstand the power of the seal weapon, but they could not. Perhaps from the very beginning, she had been waiting for them to gather around before using this legendary Chu weapon. I want to know if a magical artifact like the Sumera formation will still be useful if we don't engage in close combat. Wei Wujiu looked at the provocative Consort Zhao and said coldly. When he said this, a bone-like brilliance accompanied by a powerful life bond aura appeared in front of him. A pale white sword floated in front of him. This sword seemed to be made of white bones, and it exuded a very ancient aura. Using a sword is better than using a practitioner weapon because you can change it according to your mind. No matter how strong a practitioner weapon was, how could it be placed outside the body and move as one wished? Swords can be used frequently, and weapons can be used frequently? Wei Wujiu looked at Consort Zhao and said slowly, "Chu will be destroyed by Qin. This is inevitable." A clear wind blew in front of him. His sword flew out. The air was filled with dense white qi, and hundreds of white sword shadows instantly flowed in the air. The rest of the Qin grandmasters also came to their senses. 12 sword lights flew out like serpents and landed around Consort Zhao and Xiang Yin. Every grandmaster chose a different path after reaching the natal realm. Many people did not use flying swords as their main means of fighting. The reason was that if a sword was not in the hand, it could not perfectly carry more vital essence and the yuan qi of heaven and earth in an instant. Other than this, for cultivators above Realm 7, the distance of space was greatly reduced. Some people's figures were even faster than flying swords. Yet most Qin Grandmasters' life bond item was a sword. While they did not use flying swords as their primary weapon after reaching Realm 7, they used flying swords for a long time in their cultivation. Naturally, they knew how to use flying swords. Even more importantly, even if they used flying swords to fight, the power of a dozen Grandmasters working together was still terrifying. These flying swords even cut through the primal energies of the universe in this area and covered down like an umbrella. They cut the area where Consort Zhao and Xiang Yin were into an independent world. These swords were all Grandmaster swords. As they flew through each other, their own sword path did not affect the sword energies of the other flying swords and caused the sword essences of the surrounding swords to grow stronger. Such a scene, in the eyes of Consort Zhao and Xiang Yin, was inexplicably beautiful. Very few people in the world could see so many powerful Grandmasters working together to use swords. Seeing such a scene, Consort Zhao's lips curled up slightly. She said softly in disdain, "You don't even dare to come close. How can you kill me? Follow me," she said softly to Xiang Yin. Then her figure disappeared from her spot. She dashed forward, heading towards where Wei Wujiu and Feng Qilin were. A unique seal weapon appeared in her hand. It looked like a piece of yellow rotten wood, but this piece of rotten wood was covered in tiny seal scripts as though there were ants crawling on it. In this moment, these seal scripts lit up and gave off blinding golden light. They seemed to crawl furiously on this seal weapon like ants. They piled up and then flew into the air as though they had grown wings. The golden seal scripts flew into the air. Each tiny seal script gave off a destructive presence that caused even Realm 7s to tremble. Such a crazy woman. Wei Wujiu looked at Consort Zhao, whose phoenix robes seemed to be burning, and shook his head. None of the other practitioner weapons in the legends had such a presence. This rotten wood-like practitioner weapon was the Sumeru formation. She wanted to charge into their midst and activate this seal weapon. She cultivated her own body. When she charged at full power, even the flying swords could not stop her. However, how could this kind of impact stop them from scattering? As he shook his head, an indescribable ruthlessness appeared on his face. It was as if a layer of metallic luster covered his face. He did not dodge. He took a deep breath and recalled his life source sword. The true essence in his body was forced out of his body. In an instant, his entire body seemed to expand endlessly. Even if he and she were seriously injured at the same time, in the next moment, this top existence of the Chu dynasty would not be able to avoid the fate of being killed. The other Qin Grandmasters perceptively sensed his intentions. With several shouts, even the cultivator who had been following him flew out. These Grandmasters were not pedantic. As long as they could reach their final goal, they did not care about the process, especially when this was Wei Wujiu's own choice. A golden light followed closely behind Consort Zhao. In this moment, many people were shocked at Xiang Yan's speed. This gold dagger army commander's flying speed was not much slower than Consort Zhao. If there were any variables, this gold dagger army commander would be the biggest variable in the eyes of these Qin Grandmasters. Not far from Lian Bo, Zhang Quangdao's cultivation was at the bottom of the 13 Qin Grandmasters, and he was the least noticeable. At this time, his figure also stopped. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.